Welcome to War Sleep Stories. Today, we will be listening to relaxing war stories and sounds to make you fall asleep, but before that, kindly like and subscribe. Thank you.
The story of Operation Argus. The year was 1958, a time when the world was caught in the icy grip of the Cold War. High above the sprawling expanse of the South Atlantic Ocean, an audacious military operation was about to unfold. The operation's name was Argus, shrouded in secrecy and urgency, and its goal was as daring as it was perilous: to test nuclear weapons in the uncharted realm of space. Beneath the calm waves of the Atlantic, ships of the U.S. Navy formed a silent, drifting armada. Aboard them, scientists, engineers, and soldiers worked tirelessly, their every move dictated by the clock. The mission was clear: to detonate high-altitude nuclear devices and unravel the mysteries of the Christophilos effect, a theory suggesting that artificial radiation belts could shield America from Soviet aggression. But for the crew and the masterminds behind Argus, success came with no guarantees. The stakes were monumental, and the dangers, even more so. In the makeshift operations room aboard the USS Norton Sound, Captain Harry Wallace leaned over a radar console. His eyes swept across the flickering green dots, his mind racing with calculations. Nearby, a young physicist, Dr. Linda Callahan, adjusted her thick-rimmed glasses, her hands trembling as she prepared to validate Nicholas Christophilos' bold hypothesis. Theirs was a story among many, intertwined with the fate of a mission that could alter the balance of power, or plunge humanity into a new level of uncertainty. As the countdown ticked closer to launch, the hum of the ship's engines reverberated through the cold steel corridors. Above them, the stars glittered indifferently. Below, the restless sea bore witness to mankind's relentless pursuit of dominance and survival. The Cold War dominated every corner of global politics. From Washington to Moscow, fear and mistrust defined the era. Both superpowers sought technological superiority, their arsenals swelling with weapons capable of unimaginable destruction. The specter of nuclear war loomed over the globe like a shadow, and no one was immune to its dread. In 1957, the Soviet Union's successful launch of Sputnik shook the United States to its core. If Moscow could conquer the heavens, what was stopping them from turning space into a battlefield? That same year, physicist Nicholas Christophilos published his groundbreaking, but classified, theory. He envisioned high-altitude nuclear explosions creating artificial radiation belts to disable enemy warheads. It was a radical idea, and the Defense Nuclear Agency was eager to test it. The stage for Operation Argus was set in the desolate expanse of the South Atlantic. Far from prying eyes, the United States Navy mobilized a secretive task force, including scientists from the Livermore Laboratory and military personnel sworn to silence. It was a race against time, with impending international bans on atmospheric testing threatening to shut down their efforts. On a moonlit night in early August 1958, the fleet departed from Charleston, South Carolina. For the young sailor Jim "Red" Dawson, it was his first voyage on the USS Norton Sound. He watched the coastline fade into the distance, his thoughts drifting to his family back home. Like many aboard, Red was unaware of the mission's full scope, only that it involved rockets, radiation, and a chance to serve his country. Task Force 88 was unlike any other naval operation. Composed of 4,500 personnel, 3 warships, and 2 aircraft carriers, it operated under a veil of absolute secrecy. Each vessel had its role, from launching missiles to monitoring atmospheric data. At its core was the USS Norton Sound, a floating laboratory retrofitted to serve as the operations hub. The commander of Task Force 88, Rear Admiral John W. Hubbard, was a veteran strategist known for his calm demeanor and sharp intellect. At 52, he was the embodiment of naval tradition, commanding respect from sailors and scientists alike. Despite the task force's outward cohesion, tensions simmered beneath the surface. The scientists, including Christophilos himself, clashed with military officers over priorities and protocols. For Dr. Callahan, the challenge lay in balancing her loyalty to the mission with her unease over its ethical implications. Meanwhile, young sailors like Red Dawson marveled at the strange equipment filling their ship's hold. The long cylindrical rockets, bearing the proud insignia of Lockheed Corporation, seemed to belong to another world. The whispers among the crew spoke of experiments that would light up the night sky and send shockwaves rippling across the ocean. But to what end? Few dared to ask. By the summer of 1958, the geopolitical stakes had escalated to unprecedented levels. Soviet advancements in missile technology had rattled American defense planners, pushing the boundaries of conventional military thinking. The idea of weaponizing the Earth's magnetosphere wasn't just science fiction, it became a strategic imperative. In California's Livermore laboratory, Nicholas Christophilos, a physicist of Greek origin, spent countless nights refining his hypothesis. He envisioned a barrier of electrons, created by detonating nuclear devices high above the atmosphere, which could disrupt enemy warheads and blind radar systems. Skeptics questioned the practicality of such a plan, but Christophilos' reputation for brilliance silenced many critics. In Washington, the Defense Nuclear Agency gave the green light to proceed. Funding flowed swiftly from the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project. The project's code name changed multiple times, from Hardtech Argus to Floral, before finally settling on Operation Argus. Security was paramount. Even within military circles, few knew the true nature of the mission. Back at sea, the task force's sailors and officers began their voyage southward. For Rear Admiral Hubbard, each day was a logistical challenge, ensuring the delicate scientific equipment remained operational amid the salty air and rolling waves. For others, like Petty Officer Carla Ruiz, a radar technician aboard the USS Tarawa, the monotony of life at sea was punctuated only by whispers of what lay ahead. "They say we're lighting fireworks in space," Carla joked one evening in the mess hall, masking her own apprehension. As Task Force 88 neared its destination in the South Atlantic, the scale of the operation became clear. Aboard the USS Norton Sound, the main deck had been transformed into a makeshift rocket launch pad. Technicians meticulously assembled the X-17 missiles, each carrying a nuclear payload capable of unleashing immense power. Every bolt tightened and wire connected brought them closer to history, or disaster. Dr. Linda Callahan stood by a cluster of scientists, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. The team rehearsed their roles for the upcoming tests, each sequence planned down to the millisecond. "Failure is not an option," a senior engineer reminded them. The weight of the statement hung heavy in the humid air. Meanwhile, sailors like Red Dawson carried out mundane yet crucial tasks, hauling supplies, cleaning equipment, and standing watch under the relentless sun. The secrecy surrounding the mission left many uneasy. Red often found himself gazing at the horizon, wondering what sort of world they were creating with these experiments. One evening, as the fleet drifted under a canopy of stars, Rear Admiral Hubbard addressed the crew. His voice, calm yet resolute, carried across the deck. "We are here to test the limits of human ingenuity and defend our nation. The risks are great, but so too is the reward. Stay focused. Stay disciplined." The crew responded with a sharp, unified, "Sir," though unease lingered in the silence that followed. The morning of August 27, 1958, was calm, the ocean an endless expanse of blue. The first missile, loaded onto the launch platform, stood tall against the sky. Inside the operations room, the countdown began. Technicians monitored their instruments, their voices steady as they relayed status updates. The tension was palpable. At 0 hour, a plume of fire erupted from the X-17's base, propelling it into the heavens. On deck, sailors shielded their eyes from the blinding light. Within minutes, the missile reached its target altitude, and a brilliant flash lit up the upper atmosphere. For a brief moment, it was as if a second sun had appeared in the sky. The explosion's aftereffects rippled across the electromagnetic spectrum. Ground stations and satellite trackers scrambled to record the data, while scientists aboard the fleet monitored the formation of artificial radiation belts. Christofylo's theory was proving correct, but the implications were sobering. The charged particles, while impressive, dissipated quickly, raising doubts about their effectiveness in a real conflict. As night fell, the glow from the explosion lingered faintly in the sky. Dr. Callahan joined the crew on deck, their faces illuminated by the eerie light. "We've made history today," she said softly, though her words carried a tone of unease. Red Dawson, standing nearby, stared silently at the stars, wondering how his small role fit into the grand scheme of this operation. Only a few days had passed since the first detonation, but the rhythm aboard the ships was unrelenting. On September 3, 1958, the crew prepared for the second test. This time, the detonation would occur at a higher altitude, pushing the boundaries of Christofylo's hypothesis. The calm sea belied the intensity of the activity on deck. As the second X-17 missile was secured to the launch pad, Rear Admiral Hubbard stood in the control room, observing the final preparations. "This one needs to be perfect," he muttered to his aide, his voice betraying the weight of command. The success of the operation depended on every piece of machinery and every individual operating flawlessly. At precisely 0900 hours, the missile roared into the sky. The crew watched in awe as it pierced through the atmosphere, leaving a fiery trail in its wake. Minutes later, at an altitude of 500 miles, the warhead detonated. This time, the resulting burst created a dazzling aurora-like effect, visible even from the distant shores of South America. The scientific team worked feverishly to analyze the results. Instruments recorded a brief but intense surge in the artificial radiation belt. Christofylos, though visibly excited, knew the findings were a double-edged sword. The radiation belt dissipated faster than anticipated, limiting its tactical utility. For the sailors like Carla Ruiz, who had no part in the scientific deliberations, the spectacle was equal parts awe-inspiring and unsettling. "We're playing with forces bigger than ourselves," she murmured, staring at the fading glow in the sky. In the aftermath of the second detonation, debates raged within the scientific team. Dr. Callahan found herself increasingly at odds with Christofylos. While he viewed the results as a triumph of human ingenuity, she couldn't shake the ethical questions surrounding their work. "What if this falls into the wrong hands?" she asked during a heated discussion in the mess hall. Her concerns were not unfounded. News of Operation Argus had been tightly controlled, but the geopolitical implications of their experiments were vast. A few whispered conversations among the crew hinted at fears of Soviet retaliation. Rear Admiral Hubbard addressed these concerns during a briefing, reminding his officers that secrecy was paramount. "The world isn't ready for what we're doing," he said, his tone grave. Meanwhile, Red Dawson spent his evenings writing letters to his family. He avoided mentioning the operation, sticking to mundane details about life aboard the ship. Yet in his heart, he grappled with a growing unease. What will they tell people about us, years from now? He wondered aloud to Carla one evening. She shrugged, her expression distant. They'll say we did what we had to. Whether it was right or not, that's for history to decide. The third and final test was scheduled for September 9, 1958. The atmosphere aboard the fleet was a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. This detonation, at an altitude of 1,000 miles, would be the highest yet. Every member of the task force understood the significance of the moment. For many, it felt like the culmination of weeks of effort and uncertainty. The launch went smoothly, the X-17 soaring higher than its predecessors. When the warhead detonated, the resulting explosion was visible from the ground stations thousands of miles away. The artificial radiation belt formed rapidly, its charged particles creating a stunning visual display. Scientists scrambled to record the data, their voices echoing through the control room. As the glow faded, a solemn silence settled over the crew. The mission was complete, but the results painted a complex picture. While the Christophilos effect was real, its practical applications were limited. More importantly, the tests had demonstrated humanity's ability to manipulate the upper atmosphere, raising profound questions about the consequences of such power. On the deck of the USS Norton Sound, Dr. Callahan stood beside Rear Admiral Hubbard. "We've done what we set out to do," she said softly. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yes. But at what cost?" For a moment, neither spoke. The sea stretched endlessly before them, its surface unbroken by the waves of history yet to come. With the final test complete, Task Force 88 began the journey back to the United States. The mood aboard the ships was subdued, a mixture of relief and reflection. For weeks, the South Atlantic had been their isolated stage, a canvas for experiments that few outside their ranks would ever know existed. On the USS Tarawa, Petty Officer Carla Ruiz reflected on the sights she had witnessed. The dazzling auroras and sudden bursts of light felt as though they belonged to another world, a realm of uncharted forces humans barely understood. Sitting in the mess hall, she overheard discussions among her peers, some spoke of pride, others voiced unease. "We just launched the most dangerous fireworks show in history," one sailor quipped. The laughter that followed was strained. For Rear Admiral Hubbard, the return voyage was an opportunity to consolidate the operations data. Reports were compiled, classified, and prepared for submission to the Defense Nuclear Agency. Yet even as he reviewed the findings, Hubbard couldn't shake a gnawing feeling. The experiments had revealed humanity's ability to harness the power of space, but they had also opened a Pandora's box. What would future generations do with such knowledge? The scientists aboard Task Force 88 worked tirelessly to analyze the data collected during the tests. Dr. Linda Callahan spent long hours in the cramped research quarters, poring over magnetic field readings and electron density measurements. The results confirmed what Christophilos had hypothesized: the artificial radiation belts were real, but their effectiveness as a defense mechanism was questionable. In one of their many discussions, Dr. Callahan confronted Christophilos. "It's brilliant science, but it dissipates too quickly to be of practical use. We've risked so much for something that barely lasts." Christophilos, undeterred, replied with conviction. "Every discovery starts with a step into the unknown. The implications might not be immediate, but they're there." Their debate underscored the growing divide within the scientific team. Some saw the operation as a groundbreaking achievement, while others viewed it as a reckless gamble. For Linda, the ethical concerns remained paramount. "We've shown the world that we can manipulate the skies," she wrote in her journal one night. "But have we also shown them how to destroy it? As the fleet neared Charleston, South Carolina, the sailors and scientists prepared to disembark. For many, the journey home was bittersweet. They had accomplished their mission, but the weight of its implications lingered. The secrecy surrounding Operation Argus meant there would be no public parades or recognition. Their work, for better or worse, would remain in the shadows. Red Dawson stood at the bow of the USS Norton Sound, watching the coastline come into view. The familiar sight of home filled him with a sense of relief, but also a strange unease. The letters he had written during the voyage remained unsent, their contents now feeling inadequate to describe the enormity of what he had experienced. In the weeks that followed, Task Force 88 quietly disbanded. The sailors returned to their families, the scientists to their laboratories. Official reports were filed away under layers of classification, inaccessible to all but a select few. Operation Argus faded from public memory before it even had a chance to be known. For Rear Admiral Hubbard, the end of the mission marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with unanswered questions. Sitting in his office in Washington, he reviewed the final report, his mind drawn to the ethical dilemmas raised by the operation. "We've proven we can reshape the natural world," he wrote in a personal note. "But what will history remember us for?" Dr. Callahan, back at the Livermore Laboratory, struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. The echoes of the operation haunted her, particularly the knowledge that their work could inspire future weapons programs. She began corresponding with other scientists, raising concerns about the moral responsibilities of their profession. Though her voice was small, it was not alone. For sailors like Red Dawson and Carla Ruiz, life moved on. Yet their memories of the operation remained vivid. Red often thought of the flashes in the sky, the strange beauty of the explosions, and the questions they left behind. "We were part of something big," he told Carla during a reunion years later. "But I still don't know if it was right." The Cold War's silent arms race continued unabated as Operation Argus disappeared into classified files. Its results fed into the United States' broader strategy to deter Soviet aggression, but the lessons learned during the mission left a ripple effect among those involved. For Rear Admiral Hubbard, the operation's secrecy epitomized the era. "This isn't a war of bombs and battles," he noted in his private journal, "but of ideas, fear, and shadows." At the Pentagon, high-ranking officials sifted through Operation Argus findings. The Christophilos effect had proven real but fleeting. Scientists debated its relevance, some eager to explore its scientific potential, others wary of its military implications. Meanwhile, rumors of Soviet interest in similar tests reached U.S. intelligence. The race to dominate not just Earth, but space, was accelerating. In the sleepy town of Livermore, California, Dr. Linda Callahan resumed her work at the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory. The once familiar surroundings felt foreign to her. She had seen firsthand what their research could achieve, and now, every equation carried the weight of its consequences. She began pushing for open scientific discourse, even as classified protocols restricted her ability to speak. Operation Argus remained shrouded in secrecy for years. Its details, buried deep within government archives, were protected by layers of bureaucracy. Even among the crew, only a handful knew the operation's full scope. For most sailors, it became a footnote in their service records, a vague entry with no accompanying explanation. Red Dawson, now a veteran, struggled to reconcile his role in the operation. Back in his hometown of Charleston, he often visited the docks where the fleet had embarked years ago. He wondered if the local community would ever know the truth about what had transpired beyond the horizon. His letters, now faded and yellowed, remained a silent testament to his thoughts during those tense weeks at sea. Carla Ruiz, now stationed on a different ship, found herself haunted by memories of the glowing skies. One night, during a routine deployment, she confided in a fellow officer. "We played with forces we didn't understand," she said. "Sometimes I wonder if we opened doors that should have stayed closed." By the early 1960s, the legacy of Operation Argus began to surface in subtle ways. Scientists studying the Van Allen radiation belts referenced data from the Argus tests, albeit without acknowledging their classified origins. The artificial radiation belts had proven temporary, but they provided valuable insights into how the Earth's magnetosphere interacted with high-energy particles. For Dr. Callahan, this was bittersweet validation. In private correspondence with her colleagues, she advocated for transparency in such experiments. "The science belongs to humanity," she wrote in a letter to a prominent physicist. "But secrecy makes it a weapon, not a tool." Meanwhile, Red Dawson and Carla Ruiz found ways to move forward. Red began attending veterans gatherings, where he shared fragments of his experiences, careful not to reveal classified details. Carla, promoted to Chief Petty Officer, mentored younger sailors, often reminding them of the importance of asking questions. "Never take your role for granted," she would say. "Even the smallest cog in the machine matters." In 1971, over a decade after the tests, details of Operation Argus were partially declassified. Journalists and historians pieced together the story, uncovering the audacious plan to detonate nuclear weapons in space. Public reaction was mixed. Some hailed it as a testament to American ingenuity, while others condemned it as reckless experimentation with the planet's environment. For Rear Admiral Hubbard, now retired, the declassification offered little solace. Living quietly in Virginia, he followed the news with a mixture of pride and regret. "We were pioneers," he told a reporter during a rare interview. "But we were also prisoners of our time. Fear drove us to do extraordinary things, some wise, some not." Dr. Callahan, too, saw the revelations as a turning point. She began speaking at academic conferences, urging scientists to consider the ethical dimensions of their work. Her presentations, while controversial, gained a small but loyal following among those who believed science should serve humanity, not secrecy. The story of Operation SCEPTIC. In the shadowed terrain of Angola, where vast savannas met dense thickets, a battle of unprecedented scale was brewing. It was 1980, and the South African Border War, a brutal conflict driven by politics, ideology, and the shifting tides of the Cold War, had reached a fever pitch. This war wasn't just about borders or land, it was about influence, survival, and the clash of opposing worlds. The story of Operation SCEPTIC, unfolding over June and July of that fateful year, became a defining chapter in the annals of this conflict. Soldiers, freedom fighters, and civilians alike found their lives irrevocably intertwined in a theater of war that stretched far beyond the Angolan bushveld. This operation would mark South Africa's most extensive military incursion into Angola since the war began, a daring assault designed to dismantle SWAPO's, Southwest Africa People's Organization, fortified bases. Here, in the dust and fire of the battlefield, human stories emerged. Men and women on both sides of the divide fought not just for nations but for beliefs, families, and futures. It is their intertwined perspectives, from a South African conscript to a Namibian insurgent and an Angolan villager, that guide us through the story of Operation SCEPTIC, a tale of courage, despair, and the enduring cost of war. The air was tense with anticipation in Windhoek, Southwest Africa. Inside the headquarters of the South African Defence Force, SADF, Major General Ian Gleeson pored over reconnaissance reports. Intelligence had pinpointed a network of SWAPO bases near the Angolan town of Chifufua. These bases, well fortified and housing hundreds of insurgents, were launching points for guerrilla raids into Southwest Africa. The decision was clear: they had to be neutralized. The room buzzed with urgency as officers debated strategies. Among them was Lieutenant Peter Murray, a young officer whose keen eyes betrayed his apprehension. This was not going to be a skirmish but a large-scale invasion. For many, including Peter, this would be their first taste of real war. The thought of leading men into the unknown filled him with a mix of dread and determination. Meanwhile, across the border in Angola, SWAPO commanders had no illusions about the enemy's intentions. Jonas Utoni, a seasoned guerrilla fighter, gathered his men in a clearing. The sound of distant gunfire and the ever-present drone of helicopters served as grim reminders of the approaching storm. "We fight for our land," he told them, his voice steady. "We fight for freedom." Unbeknownst to these leaders, a small Angolan village lay directly in the path of destruction. Maria, a farmer's wife, tended to her crops under a sunlit sky. Her village, Molemba, had lived through its share of violence, but nothing could have prepared them for what was to come. As her children played nearby, the ground beneath their feet trembled, a harbinger of the chaos descending upon them. The South African Defense Force, SADF, mobilized with precision. At their staging grounds near the Angolan border, convoys of armored vehicles, supply trucks, and helicopter gunships readied for the strike. Soldiers like Private Johan Botha, barely out of school, stared at the sprawling machinery of war with a mixture of awe and trepidation. For many conscripts like Johan, this was not a choice but an obligation, a government-mandated service in a war they barely understood. Briefings were hurried but thorough. Maps were spread across tables under the glare of harsh military lighting, marking the enemy bases scattered across Angola's terrain. The primary target was Shifufua, a heavily fortified SWAPO stronghold. Major General Gleason emphasized speed and surprise. "We hit hard and fast," he declared. "Their capacity to retaliate must be shattered before they can regroup." Across the border, SWAPO fighters prepared in their own way. Jonas Utoni and his comrades dug deeper into their trenches, reinforcing their defenses with sandbags and logs. Shifufua's defenses had withstood attacks before, but this time felt different. The frequency of reconnaissance aircraft overhead signaled that the South Africans were planning something bigger. "They underestimate us," Jonas said to his friend Elias, loading his rifle. "But we've fought them off before, and we will do it again." In Molemba, Maria's husband, Paulo, sensed trouble as he watched vehicles pass through the dirt paths leading to their village. Angolan soldiers had warned the locals to evacuate, but where could they go? The land was their livelihood, their only refuge. That night, as Maria sang a lullaby to their children, Paulo lay awake, listening to the eerie stillness outside. The drums of war were beating louder. In the pre-dawn hours of June 10, 1980, Operation SCEPTIC commenced. The quiet of the Angolan bush was shattered by the roar of engines as SADF convoys crossed the border. Dust clouds trailed behind them, blotting out the rising sun. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their blades slicing through the heavy air, while soldiers gripped their rifles tightly. For Johan Botha, the reality of war was sinking in. Each jolt of the vehicle seemed to carry him closer to danger. The initial thrust was swift. The South Africans targeted outlying SWAPO positions, aiming to cut off communications and isolate Shifufua. At first, resistance was light, sporadic gunfire echoed through the savannah. The SADF forces pushed forward, their advance marked by plumes of smoke and the distant sound of explosions. At Shifufua, Jonas Utoni watched the horizon. Word of the South African incursion had reached the base hours earlier, Fighters scrambled to their positions, while commanders barked orders. Despite their training and resolve, an undercurrent of unease swept through the ranks. Jonas tightened his grip on his rifle, his thoughts drifting to his family back in northern Namibia. Would he see them again? In Molemba, the ground shook with the approach of armored vehicles. Paulo rushed to gather his family, urging Maria to pack what they could carry. The villagers' panic was palpable as they fled into the surrounding bush. Maria clutched her youngest child tightly, her heart pounding with fear. Behind her, the familiar sights of her home disappeared into the haze of dust and smoke. The SAD's advance reached its first major obstacle, a heavily fortified SWAPO outpost near Kwamato. What began as a calculated offensive turned into a fierce firefight. SWAPO fighters, entrenched and well-armed, launched a barrage of gunfire and mortars at the approaching columns. The calm, methodical movements of the South African soldiers gave way to chaos as explosions erupted around them. Private Johan Botha hit the ground as bullets whizzed past. His training kicked in, and he returned fire, though his hands trembled. Beside him, Corporal Van Tonder barked orders, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. Johan had never felt so small, so vulnerable. This wasn't the heroic battle he had imagined, it was survival. Jonas Utoni was among the fighters defending the outpost. The attack was relentless, but he and his comrades stood firm, firing with precision. As the hours dragged on, the lines blurred between courage and desperation. Jonas thought of the stories of those who had fallen before him and resolved to make every bullet count. As the day wore on, the SADF finally breached the defenses, but at a cost. Smoke billowed from destroyed vehicles, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. Among the SWAPO fighters, those who survived retreated further into the bush, determined to regroup and continue the fight. For Johan, the sight of fallen comrades etched itself into his memory, a haunting reminder of the price of war. The South African forces pressed deeper into Angola, their progress marked by charred landscapes and the remnants of SWAPO defenses. The heat was oppressive, and the air carried the acrid smell of gunpowder and smoke. For Private Johan Botha, each step felt heavier than the last. He was beginning to grasp the enormity of what lay ahead, a relentless push through hostile territory, where every tree and shadow could conceal an enemy. Helicopters hovered low, providing aerial support. Pilots relayed updates about enemy movements, while gunships unleashed bursts of machine gun fire to clear paths for the advancing troops. Major General Ian Gleason monitored the operation closely, his radio crackling with reports. The mission was progressing, but the resistance was stiffening. He knew the worst was yet to come. At Shifufua, Jonas Utoni and his fellow fighters prepared for a siege. Supplies were rationed, and every available weapon was ready. The knowledge that the South Africans were closing in fueled both fear and resolve. Jonas found a quiet moment to write a letter to his wife, knowing it might never reach her. "If I fall," he wrote, "let my children know I stood for our land." In the bush near Molemba, Maria and her family crouched under the cover of trees, hiding from the sounds of vehicles and gunfire. Her children whimpered softly, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. Paulo tried to reassure them, but his own fear was evident. They were caught between two forces far beyond their control, their lives reduced to a desperate attempt to survive. By the time the SADF reached the outskirts of Shifufua, the tension was palpable. This was the operation's primary target, a sprawling complex of bunkers, trenches, and fortified positions. As the first shells were fired, the ground shook, and the sky darkened with smoke. The battle for Shifufua had begun. SWAPO fighters responded with a ferocity born of necessity. Mortars and anti-aircraft guns, repurposed for ground combat, roared to life. Jonas Utoni moved from position to position, directing fire and bolstering morale. "Hold your ground," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The South Africans had superior firepower, but SWAPO had the advantage of knowing the terrain. Johan Botha crouched behind a rock, his ears ringing from the constant explosions. He could see the flashes of gunfire in the distance and hear the cries of wounded men. Around him, the seasoned soldiers seemed calm, focused. Johan envied their composure but couldn't shake the knot of fear in his stomach. As the hours turned into days, the battle raged on. The SADF launched wave after wave of assaults, each met with fierce resistance. Shifufua's defenses were gradually worn down, but the cost was high on both sides. For Jonas, every loss of a comrade was a blow, but retreat was not an option. "We fight here," he told his men. "If we fall with honor." While the battle for Shifufua consumed the attention of both armies, the surrounding areas became collateral damage. Molemba, once a quiet village, was now a ghost town. Maria and Paulo watched from their hiding place as their home was consumed by flames. Soldiers, both SADF and SWAPO, moved through the area, searching for supplies and potential threats. One evening, a group of SWAPO fighters stumbled upon the family's hiding spot. Jonas Utoni was among them. His stern demeanor softened when he saw the terrified faces of Maria's children. "We mean no harm," he assured them. "We're here to protect our people." Though wary, Paulo offered what little food they had left. Jonas thanked him and moved on, leaving behind a promise: "Stay hidden. This land is not safe." For Maria, the encounter was a grim reminder of the war's reach. No one, not even the innocent, was spared its touch. She prayed for the safety of her children, for an end to the violence, and for the hope of returning to a life that now seemed impossibly distant. The siege of Shifufua reached its climax on a sweltering afternoon. After days of relentless bombardment, the South African forces breached the final line of defense. Jonas Utoni and his remaining fighters made a last stand, their ammunition dwindling and their positions overrun. The sound of battle was deafening. Grenades exploded in rapid succession, and the rattle of machine guns filled the air. Jonas fought until his rifle ran dry, then grabbed a fallen comrade's weapon and continued. He knew they couldn't hold, but surrender was not an option. For Johan Botha, the moment of victory felt hollow. As the dust settled, he walked through the ruins of Shifufua, his boots crunching on spent shell casings. The sight of lifeless bodies, both friend and foe, brought no sense of triumph. War, he realized, was not about winning or losing. It was about surviving and bearing the weight of what you'd seen. As night fell, the SADF secured the area. Major General Gleason declared the operation a success, but even he couldn't ignore the heavy toll. The cost of victory, measured in lives and destruction, was staggering. The morning after the fall of Shifufua was eerily quiet. The once formidable base lay in ruins, its bunkers reduced to rubble and its defenders either captured or killed. Smoke rose in curling plumes, carrying the acrid scent of destruction. For Johan Botha, the silence was as unsettling as the battle had been. As he walked through the remnants of the base, he saw the personal belongings of fallen fighters, letters, photographs, and makeshift shelters. Each item told a story, now abruptly ended. Jonas Utoni was among the few who had managed to escape. Injured and exhausted, he and a handful of comrades trekked through the dense Angolan bush. Each step was a struggle, but the fire of resistance burned brightly in his chest. "We live to fight another day," he whispered to himself, his resolve unbroken. Meanwhile, the villagers of Molemba emerged cautiously from their hiding places. Maria and Paolo returned to find their home destroyed. The fields they had tended with care were scorched, their livestock scattered. Maria held her children close, determined to rebuild. "We have nothing left," Paolo said, his voice heavy with despair. But Maria, with quiet strength, replied, "We have each other. That's enough to start again." The South African forces began withdrawing, their objectives achieved. Trucks loaded with weary soldiers and captured equipment rumbled southward. For Major General Gleason, the operation was a strategic success, but the human cost weighed heavily. In his report to superiors, he noted the destruction inflicted on the enemy but privately questioned the long-term impact. Back in Southwest Africa, the returning soldiers were greeted with fanfare, but for many, the celebrations felt hollow. Johann Botha struggled to shake the memories of what he had seen. The faces of fallen comrades and the cries of the wounded haunted his dreams. He tried to find solace in letters from home, but the words felt distant, unable to bridge the gulf between his experiences and the world he had left behind. For Jonas Utoni, the aftermath was a time of reflection. He and his comrades regrouped at a remote SWAPO camp, sharing their stories of survival. Jonas took it upon himself to write a report detailing the lessons learned from Shifufua's fall. "We fought bravely," he wrote, "but we underestimated their strength. Next time, we will be ready." In Molemba, Maria worked tirelessly to rebuild what little she could. She salvaged materials from the ruins and planted new crops in the hope of a better harvest. The scars of war were everywhere, on the land, on her husband's face, and in the eyes of her children. But she refused to let despair take root. Her determination became a beacon of hope for the other villagers, who rallied around her efforts. Across the region, the ripple effects of Operation SCEPTIC were felt. SWAPO intensified its efforts to recruit and train fighters, while the SADF refined its tactics for future operations. The war showed no signs of abating, and the cycle of violence seemed unbreakable. SWAPO's leadership vowed to avenge the losses at Shifufua. Plans were set in motion for retaliatory strikes against South African targets. Jonas Utoni was tasked with leading a reconnaissance mission to identify vulnerabilities along the border. The mission was dangerous, requiring stealth and quick thinking, but Jonas welcomed the challenge. "Every step we take is a step toward freedom," he told his men. Meanwhile, the SADF braced for counterattacks. In Windhoek, Major General Gleason convened his officers to discuss intelligence reports of increased SWAPO activity. Patrols were doubled, and defensive positions were reinforced. For soldiers like Johann Botha, the respite after Shifufua was short-lived. He was redeployed to a border outpost, where the tension was as thick as the summer heat. In Molemba, Maria's rebuilding efforts brought the community together. She organized the villagers to repair a damaged well and clear debris from the roads. Despite the hardship, there was a sense of solidarity. Paulo, inspired by Maria's strength, began to believe that their village could survive the storm of war. But the threat of violence was never far. One evening, as Maria prepared a modest meal, distant gunfire echoed through the hills. The children huddled close, their eyes wide with fear. Maria whispered a prayer, hoping that the war would pass them by this time. The war showed no signs of slowing. For every victory claimed by one side, there were losses on the other. The terrain of Angola became a chessboard, with villages, bases, and lives serving as pawns. Both the SADF and SWAPO were locked in a brutal dance, each seeking to outmaneuver the other. Jonas Utoni's reconnaissance mission proved successful, uncovering weaknesses in the South African defenses. He returned to his camp with vital intelligence, his spirits buoyed by the prospect of striking back. Yet, he couldn't ignore the toll the war was taking on his comrades. Many were injured, fatigued, or disillusioned. Jonas did his best to inspire them, but he knew that the fight ahead would demand everything they had left. For Johan Botha, life at the border outpost was a constant battle against fear and monotony. Every sound in the night carried the possibility of an attack. He found solace in the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers, but the weight of the war hung over them all. Letters from home became his lifeline, reminding him of the world he was fighting to protect. Maria's resilience continued to inspire her community. She encouraged the villagers to focus on what they could control, rebuilding, planting, and caring for one another. Yet, in her heart, she longed for peace, for a future where her children could grow up without the shadow of war. Months after Operation SCEPTIC, the war's intensity deepened. The South African Defence Force, SADF, increased its cross-border raids, targeting SWAPO camps and supply lines. These operations were swift and brutal, designed to cripple the insurgency. Among the soldiers deployed was Johan Botha, now hardened by his experiences at SCEPTIC. He carried himself with quiet resolve, though the shadows of the past lingered in his eyes. In response, SWAPO reorganized its forces, focusing on guerrilla tactics that could exploit the SADF's vulnerabilities. Jonas Utoni emerged as a trusted leader within SWAPO's ranks, his bravery during SCEPTIC earning him the respect of his comrades. He was assigned a new mission, to lead a series of ambushes along key transport routes. Jonas understood the risks, but his belief in the cause remained unshaken. Meanwhile, in Malemba, Maria and the villagers continued their struggle to rebuild amidst the chaos. The fields were beginning to show signs of life, and a sense of fragile hope emerged. But the sound of distant artillery reminded them that peace was still a distant dream. Maria often gathered the children to tell stories of a time before the war, her words a comforting lullaby in a world fraught with danger. The broader conflict showed no signs of resolution. International powers watched with interest, their Cold War agendas shaping the flow of weapons and support to both sides. Angola, already scarred by years of civil war, bore the brunt of this proxy struggle. The people caught in the middle, civilians like Maria and soldiers like Johan, paid the heaviest price. Jonas Utoni's unit moved under the cover of darkness, their silhouettes blending with the landscape. The plan was precise: intercept an SADF convoy traveling a supply route near the border. The night was still, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves and the muffled voices of his comrades. Jonas reviewed the strategy one last time, his voice steady but firm. "We hit hard and disappeared. No mistakes." As dawn broke, the convoy appeared, a line of armored vehicles kicking up dust as they rumbled through the savannah. Jonas signaled to his men, and the first explosion ripped through the air. The ambush was swift and chaotic. Gunfire erupted from all sides, the SWAPO fighters darting between cover as the SADF scrambled to respond. Johan Botha was in one of the rear vehicles. The initial blast jolted him awake, and within seconds, he was out of the truck, rifle in hand. The scene was a blur of smoke and shouting. He took cover behind a boulder, returning fire with a precision that belied his racing heart. The ambush lasted minutes, though it felt like hours. When the dust settled, the SWAPO fighters had melted back into the bush, leaving behind a trail of destruction. Johan surveyed the wreckage, damaged vehicles, wounded soldiers, and the lifeless forms of comrades. It was another grim reminder of the war's relentless cost. The ambush was hailed as a tactical success for SWAPO, but Jonas Utoni knew better. Several of his men had been injured, and their ammunition was running low. They retreated to a hidden camp deep in the bush, where Jonas tended to the wounded and tried to bolster morale. "We've shown them our strength," he told his men. "But the fight is far from over." In Windhoek, the SADF command reviewed the aftermath of the ambush. Major General Gleason ordered increased patrols and air reconnaissance, determined to prevent another attack. For soldiers like Johan, the heightened vigilance meant longer hours and more tension. The weight of the war pressed heavily on him, but he buried his emotions, focusing on the tasks at hand. Back in Molemba, the villagers braced for the ripple effects of the ambush. Maria noticed more soldiers passing through the area, their presence a constant reminder of the war's reach. Despite the fear, she refused to let it dictate her life. She organized the women to weave baskets and trade goods with neighboring villages, small acts of resilience in the face of uncertainty. The war's cycle of action and retaliation showed no signs of slowing. For every advance made by one side, the other found a way to counter. The conflict was not just a battle of weapons but a test of endurance, a question of who could outlast the other. As 1980 drew to a close, the South African border war entered a new phase. International pressure on South Africa intensified, with calls for an end to its apartheid policies and its military incursions into Angola. Despite this, the SADF remained resolute, launching more operations to maintain its grip on the region. SWAPO, too, adapted its strategies. Jonas Utoni found himself leading not only military operations but also efforts to strengthen community support for the cause. He visited villages to rally locals, sharing stories of resistance and promising a brighter future. "Freedom is within our reach," he told them, his words resonating with those who had suffered under South Africa's rule. For Johan Botha, the war had become a blur of missions and firefights. Each operation blended into the next, leaving little time to reflect. His letters home became shorter, his words more guarded. The boy who had left for the border was gone, replaced by a soldier hardened by experience. In Molemba, Maria continued her quiet resistance. Her children grew stronger, their laughter a rare but cherished sound. Paulo, inspired by his wife's resilience, began to believe in the possibility of a future beyond the war. Together, they held on to hope, even as the conflict raged around them. The story of Operation ALGECIRAS. The year was 1982, and the South Atlantic simmered with the fires of war. Argentina's audacious invasion of the Falkland Islands had sparked a global spotlight on the distant archipelago. As Britain readied its fleet to reclaim the territory, a different kind of battle unfolded quietly on European shores. Far from the icy waters of the Falklands, in the warm, shadowed streets of Spain, a covert operation was brewing, a desperate gamble to weaken Britain's hand. Operation ALGECIRAS was a plan born out of necessity and audacity. Its objective was deceptively simple yet immensely risky: sabotage a British warship docked in Gibraltar, forcing the Royal Navy to allocate resources closer to home. Behind the operation was Admiral Jorge Anaya, a man whose vision for victory relied on daring acts in the face of overwhelming odds. As the Falklands War escalated, Admiral Anaya sat in his office in Buenos Aires, studying maps and naval reports with steely determination. He knew that Argentina's naval forces could not hope to match the might of the British fleet in open confrontation. If we can make them bleed closer to home, he reasoned, their attention will be divided. Anaya turned to Admiral Eduardo Gerling, head of the Naval Intelligence Service, with an unorthodox request. "We need to strike at their core, not in the Falklands, but in Europe," he explained. Girling, a seasoned strategist, understood the gravity of the mission. The task was daunting, but not impossible. He set to work assembling a team, knowing that secrecy would be paramount. Even within the Argentine government, the operation would remain shrouded in darkness. The team chosen for the operation was as unconventional as the plan itself. At the helm was Héctor Rosales, a former naval officer turned spy. Rosales had spent years in the shadows, a man skilled at blending into his surroundings. Yet he was not a diver or a saboteur. For that, Girling needed specialists. Maximo Nicoletti was a natural choice. A diver with years of experience in underwater demolitions, Nicoletti had a complicated past. His father, an Italian naval veteran, had taught him the trade, but his involvement with the Montoneros, an Argentine guerrilla group, had left a stain on his record. Joining him were two former Montoneros fighters, men who had once fought the military regime but were now driven by a shared sense of patriotism. The operation was risky, and its stakes high. Yet, as the men prepared to leave for Spain, the weight of their task seemed overshadowed by a quiet determination. They would soon become ghosts, operating in the shadows of Algeciras, just across the bay from Gibraltar. The team arrived in Spain in late April, under the guise of tourists. Algeciras, with its bustling port and proximity to Gibraltar, was the perfect staging ground. The men blended into the local scene, frequenting cafes and walking the cobbled streets. Yet beneath their casual demeanor, they meticulously observed British naval activity across the bay. Nicoletti was particularly focused. Each evening, he stood at the shore, binoculars in hand, tracking the movements of Royal Navy ships. The Bay of Gibraltar sparkled under the moonlight, its waters hiding potential dangers. The plan required precision, a nighttime swim to the docked ship, attaching limpet mines, and a silent retreat to safety. Tensions began to rise as the days passed. Spanish police, aware of heightened geopolitical tensions, patrolled the area diligently. The team knew that even a small mistake could lead to disaster. But Nicoletti's calm, steady demeanor kept the group focused. They could not afford to fail. From a nondescript apartment in Algeciras, the team conducted their surveillance. Maps were spread across the kitchen table, marked with red circles denoting potential targets. Nicoletti insisted on precision, testing the equipment and rehearsing scenarios in his mind. His expertise in demolitions meant he understood the risks better than anyone. Rosales, meanwhile, maintained their cover. He chatted with locals, learning the rhythms of the town, and ensured the team stayed inconspicuous. Yet, as days turned into nights, the weight of the operation bore down on them. The men were not seasoned commandos, they were patriots, united by a shared mission but burdened by its enormity. Their target, a Royal Navy warship docked at Gibraltar, loomed large in their minds. Its crew, unaware of the threat, went about their duties while the Argentine team planned in silence. Across the bay, the British flag fluttered, a reminder of what they were up against. The days in Algeciras passed in quiet preparation. As the team refined their strategy, they knew there would be no second chances. The plan was straightforward in theory but fraught with challenges in execution. Under the cover of darkness, Nicoletti and one other diver would swim across the bay, carrying limpet mines in waterproof bags. Their target, a British warship docked in Gibraltar. The explosives were to be affixed to the ship's hull, set with timed detonators. The divers would then swim back to Algeciras, blending into the night before the mines detonated. The explosion would cripple the ship, forcing the British to divert attention and resources from the Falklands to their European waters. Nicoletti, ever meticulous, double-checked the equipment, from oxygen tanks to the mines themselves. One loose seal, he warned, and we're finished. Rosales coordinated logistics, ensuring the group's cover was intact. The weight of the mission hung heavy, but there was no room for hesitation. Nicoletti had developed an almost obsessive relationship with the waters of the Bay of Gibraltar. Each evening, he observed the tides, noted the patterns of patrol boats, and memorized the movements of British naval vessels. The bay seemed vast, yet deceptively calm, its surface shimmering under the moonlight. The distance between Algeciras and Gibraltar wasn't insurmountable, but the journey was rife with risks. British forces patrolled the area, and Spanish authorities were equally vigilant. Any disturbance in the water could trigger alarms. Nicoletti's years of diving expertise gave him confidence, but even he admitted the odds were slim. Their window of opportunity grew narrower by the day. The British, aware of potential threats, had heightened their security measures. Each delay added to the tension, but Nicoletti urged patience. "The bay has its secrets," he said, "and it will decide if we succeed or fail." On the night of April 30th, the team prepared for their first attempt. The moon hung low, its silver light casting long shadows on the shore. Nicoletti donned his diving gear, his mind focused on the task ahead. "No noise, no hesitation," he reminded his partner. "We are shadows tonight." As they moved toward the water, Rosales monitored the surroundings. The streets of Algeciras were quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic. The weight of their mission felt heavier with each step. In the stillness of the night, even the faintest splash seemed deafening. The divers slipped into the bay, their movements slow and deliberate. The cold water enveloped them, and with each stroke, the lights of Gibraltar drew closer. The mission was underway, and every second brought them closer to danger, or discovery. As the divers moved through the water, their absence on shore did not go unnoticed. Spanish police, already wary of increased activity in the area, had been monitoring the team. A tip from a local had raised suspicions about the tourists who spent their days near the harbor, observing ships with unnerving precision. A patrol car drove past the team's rented apartment, its occupants scanning the windows. Inside, Rosales remained calm, ensuring the room appeared undisturbed. The cover story of being fishing enthusiasts held up for now, but cracks in their facade began to show. On the bay, Nicoletti and his partner continued their journey, unaware of the growing danger. They were close to the ship now, their target looming like a silent sentinel in the dark. But back on shore, the walls were closing in. Nicoletti reached the target vessel, its massive hull towering above him in the water. Carefully, he retrieved the first limpet mine, his fingers steadied despite the numbing cold. Attaching the explosive required precision and speed, two things that felt at odds with the tension coursing through him. His partner, watching from below, signaled their progress. Time was slipping away, and the patrol boats circling the harbor added to the urgency. Nicoletti's breaths came in slow, measured bursts through his regulator as he secured the detonator. But then, a distant beam of light swept across the water. A searchlight. The British had increased their patrols, and now, Nicoletti's shadow danced on the ship's hull. He froze, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The water, which had seemed an ally, now felt like an accomplice to betrayal. The searchlight lingered for a moment before passing. Nicoletti completed his work and signaled to retreat. The pair began their return journey, cutting through the water with silent strokes. The mission had been perilous, but they believed they were in the clear. However, back in Algeciras, the Spanish police had begun their sweep. Rosales, noticing unusual activity outside the apartment, began to destroy documents and equipment. He knew their time was running out. The divers reached the shore, breathless and cold. As they emerged from the water, Nicoletti saw the flashing blue lights in the distance. "We've been compromised," he muttered. The mission was over, but the consequences had just begun. As the divers reached the shoreline, their senses were heightened. The rhythmic wail of a distant siren echoed in the night, piercing through the sound of waves. Nicoletti and his partner hurriedly shed their gear, their eyes darting toward the town. Blue and red lights flickered, growing closer with every passing second. Rosales, from his vantage point in the apartment, saw the patrol cars pull up to their building. His calm demeanor cracked as he began shredding documents and gathering the remaining equipment. But it was too late. A loud knock on the door sent a shiver through the room. Nicoletti and his partner attempted to blend into the shadows of the shoreline, but a patrol officer's flashlight caught the glint of their wet gear. "Alto!" the officer shouted, his weapon drawn. The divers froze, their mission undone. Within minutes, the team was surrounded, their clandestine operation now fully exposed. The Spanish police wasted no time interrogating the captured men. In a dimly lit station, Nicoletti sat silently, his face a mask of defiance. The officers bombarded him with questions about their activities, but Nicoletti offered nothing. His training had prepared him for this moment. Rosales, however, found himself in a more precarious position. The police discovered maps, surveillance notes, and partially destroyed equipment in the apartment. The evidence left little room for plausible deniability. "We were tourists," he claimed weakly, but the officers were unconvinced. As dawn broke over ALGECIRAS, the gravity of their failure sank in. The team was no longer operating in the shadows. They were prisoners, their fate now in the hands of Spanish authorities. Far across the Atlantic, Admiral Anaya awaited news that would never come. The arrest sent shockwaves through diplomatic channels. Spain, caught in the middle of the Falklands War, faced pressure to handle the matter delicately. The British, alerted to the failed sabotage attempt, demanded answers. Argentina, however, denied any involvement, dismissing the operation as the actions of rogue individuals. In Buenos Aires, Admiral Gerling and Anaya scrambled to distance themselves from the captured operatives. Officially, the Argentine government had no knowledge of Operation ALGECIRAS. Behind closed doors, however, the military high command braced for the fallout. Spain, unwilling to escalate tensions, quietly decided to deport the men back to Argentina. While the team's failure spared the Royal Navy, the operation's exposure brought an end to Argentina's hopes of opening a second front against Britain. On a quiet morning in early May, Nicoletti, Rosales, and the rest of the team were escorted to a waiting plane under heavy guard. The Spanish government, eager to avoid further scrutiny, expedited their deportation. For the operatives, it was a bittersweet reprieve. They were free from foreign custody but faced an uncertain reception back home. The flight back to Argentina was silent. Nicoletti stared out the window, his mind replaying the events of the past weeks. For all their careful planning, a single mistake had unraveled everything. Beside him, Rosales fidgeted nervously, knowing that their return would not be celebrated. As the plane touched down in Buenos Aires, the team was met by military officials who quickly ushered them away from public view. The operation that was meant to deal a blow to Britain had ended in humiliation, a footnote in the greater tragedy of the Falklands War. In the weeks following their return, the operatives faded into the shadows once more. The Argentine military, desperate to maintain its image, ensured the men would not speak of the failed mission. Nicoletti, once a daring diver with ambitions of glory, found himself relegated to obscurity. For Admiral Anaya, Operation ALGECIRAS became a bitter reminder of the challenges Argentina faced in the Falklands conflict. The failure underscored the limits of their military capabilities and the risks of overreach. Yet, in his private moments, Anaya wondered how close they had come to success, and what might have been had the operation not been foiled. Meanwhile, in Gibraltar, British forces remained on high alert. Though the mission had failed, the attempt highlighted vulnerabilities that would shape their defenses for years to come. Operation ALGECIRAS was over, but its echoes would linger in the annals of covert warfare. Back in Buenos Aires, Nicoletti retreated into a quiet life, haunted by the failure of Operation ALGECIRAS. He had been a man driven by purpose, but now, he was left to wrestle with the weight of his actions. In quiet moments, he replayed the operation in his mind, searching for the point where everything had unraveled. For Hector Rosales, the fallout was more personal. His years as a covert operative had hardened him, but this failure felt different. The secrecy surrounding the mission meant that few in Argentina even knew of his efforts. He found himself living in the shadows, burdened by a mission that would never be acknowledged. The broader implications of the operation loomed large over Admiral Anaya. While publicly maintaining his resolve, he privately questioned whether such bold risks were worth the cost. The Falklands War was far from over, and resources were stretched thin. The failed sabotage became a symbol of Argentina's limitations in the face of a formidable adversary. In Gibraltar, the British military maintained heightened vigilance in the weeks following the arrests. Patrols increased, and security protocols were reviewed to address potential vulnerabilities. The failed operation had revealed that even in the heart of Europe, the Royal Navy was not immune to threats. For the sailors stationed in Gibraltar, the discovery of the plot was a sobering reminder of the war's far-reaching consequences. "We always thought the fight was in the South Atlantic," one officer remarked. But here we were, staring down a threat at home. Operation ALGECIRAS also brought attention to Spain's delicate position in the conflict. While officially neutral, the Spanish authorities had unwittingly played a critical role in foiling the Argentine plan. The cooperation between Spain and Britain strengthened ties but also highlighted the complexities of maintaining neutrality during a global conflict. The operatives' return to Argentina was shrouded in secrecy. Military officials ensured that their arrival went unnoticed by the public. In quiet debriefings, the team recounted their efforts, their failures, and the circumstances of their capture. Nicoletti's detailed account of the mission revealed how close they had come to succeeding. "The mines were in place," he explained. "If we had one more hour, the ship would have been hit." Yet, the fact remained that they had failed, and no amount of explanation could change that. For Rosales, the debriefing felt more like an interrogation. The military junta's distrust of the Montoneros was well known, and Rosales feared that their past affiliations would overshadow their loyalty to the mission. The operatives were eventually released, but their lives remained under quiet surveillance. While Operation ALGECIRAS faded from immediate attention, the Falklands War raged on. British forces launched their counteroffensive with precision, retaking the islands in June 1982. Argentina's defeat was swift and devastating, marking the end of the military junta's grip on power. The failure of Operation ALGECIRAS became a microcosm of Argentina's broader struggles in the conflict. Overambitious plans, inadequate resources, and a failure to anticipate the enemy's strengths plagued the war effort. For those involved in the operation, the outcome was a bitter pill to swallow. In Gibraltar, the British warship that had been targeted remained unharmed, a silent witness to what might have been. Its crew, unaware of the danger they had narrowly avoided, continued their duties, their routines unaffected by the near miss. Years later, the story of Operation ALGECIRAS emerged from the classified archives, sparking interest among military historians and journalists. The operation was analyzed not just for its boldness but also for its glaring flaws. The decision to operate in Spain, a nation with close ties to Britain, was seen as a critical error. For Nicoletti, the passage of time brought clarity but little solace. "We were soldiers, not politicians," he said in a rare interview. "We did what we thought was necessary for our country." His words reflected the complexity of a mission born of desperation, carried out by men willing to risk everything. Operation ALGECIRAS remained a footnote in the broader history of the Falklands War, a story of ambition, failure, and the quiet heroism of those who dared to act. Its legacy, though overshadowed by larger events, served as a reminder of the intricate dance between war and diplomacy, where even the smallest moves could have far-reaching consequences. In the years following Operation ALGECIRAS, Maximo Nicoletti lived a life marked by quiet isolation. His expertise as a diver was no longer a source of pride but a reminder of a failed mission that had pushed him to the limits of his skills and loyalty. Settling in the outskirts of Buenos Aires, Nicoletti sought solace in routine work, avoiding the limelight. Yet, he was never far from the shadow of his past. Local whispers about his involvement in the Falklands conflict followed him, though he never confirmed or denied the rumors. Nicoletti's life became a blend of anonymity and internal reflection. The world around him moved on, but for Nicoletti, the night of the failed sabotage replayed in his mind. "It's not the failure that stays with you," he told a close friend years later. "It's the what if." Hector Rosales took a different path. His survival instincts, honed over years as a covert operative, led him to work in private security. The skills that had once made him an asset to Argentine intelligence now found use in a world where trust was scarce, and loyalty came at a price. Despite his professional success, Rosales found himself increasingly disillusioned. The mission had not only failed but had also stripped him of the sense of purpose that had driven him for so long. His attempts to reconnect with family and friends were strained, the secrets he carried built invisible walls around him. One evening, over a quiet drink in a Buenos Aires bar, a journalist approached him, asking about the operation. Rosales smiled faintly and replied, "There are stories better left untold." For the two former Montaneros who had participated in Operation ALGECIRAS, the mission had brought an unexpected twist to their lives. Once fighters against the very regime they now served, their involvement in the operation underscored the complexities of Argentine politics and loyalty. One of them, known only as Ricardo, returned to his hometown, where he lived a reclusive life. The memories of the mission, coupled with his past as a guerrilla, left him struggling with the weight of conflicting identities. The other, Alejandro, tried to channel his frustrations into writing. Under a pseudonym, he penned articles reflecting on Argentina's history of military interventions and the cost of such endeavors. While the operation remained a secret, his work hinted at the blurred lines between heroism and futility. In Gibraltar, the aftermath of Operation ALGECIRAS faded into history, but its lessons endured. British naval forces stationed there took pride in their resilience, even as the specifics of the threat remained largely unknown to the public. The warship targeted by the operation continued its service, its crew unaware of how close they had come to disaster. For Gibraltar's residents, the foiled sabotage was a fleeting reminder of the conflict that had briefly touched their shores. Life returned to its familiar rhythm, but the vigilance born of that time lingered. Local historians, years later, recounted the strange events of 1982 in their chronicles. The failed operation became a tale of intrigue, a near-mythical story of covert warfare in the shadow of the Rock of Gibraltar. Admiral Jorge Anaya, the architect of Operation ALGECIRAS, retired from public life after the end of the Falklands War. For him, the failed mission was a personal and professional blow, one he rarely spoke of in his later years. Anaya spent his final years reflecting on Argentina's military history and its missteps. While he remained a controversial figure, his role in the war and the covert operation cemented his place in Argentina's turbulent history. In one of his last interviews, he addressed Operation ALGECIRAS indirectly. "War is not just about battles fought openly," he said. "It is also about the quiet gambles we take in the dark. Sometimes, those gambles fail. But they are no less part of the story." The story of Operation KEYHOLE. The wind howled across the icy expanse of the South Atlantic, a relentless force that carried the whispers of a brewing conflict. It was the spring of 1982, but in the Falklands, it felt like the heart of winter. Tension hung heavy in the air, stretching across oceans to distant capitals in London and Buenos Aires. For years, the Falkland Islands had been a contentious issue, a quiet struggle of sovereignty in an otherwise forgotten corner of the world. Yet, as the days grew longer, it was clear that peace was slipping away. In London, intelligence reports piled on the desk of key officials, painting an ominous picture of Argentina's intentions. Far south, in the rugged terrain of the Falklands, isolated communities prepared for a storm they could not see but instinctively felt. British soldiers stationed there, long accustomed to the monotony of peacekeeping, found themselves on edge. They knew the stakes. This was more than an archipelago of windswept islands. It was about pride, legacy, and an empire that refused to fade quietly. Meanwhile, in Buenos Aires, the government faced growing unrest. To distract from domestic turmoil, leaders set their sights on the Falklands, a symbol of national identity they could rally around. Plans were drawn, orders whispered. As the chill of winter approached, so too did the shadow of invasion. Operation Rosario, as they called it, would spark a conflict that would ripple through history. On Thule Island, far removed from the world's great power struggles, the Corbeta Uruguay station stood as a quiet sentinel. Argentine personnel stationed there could not have imagined the role they would play in the coming months. The island's icy winds and barren landscapes seemed an unlikely setting for the final chapter of a war that had yet to begin. But history often unfolds in the most unexpected of places. And so, with the world watching in silence, the stage was set. The Falklands War was about to begin, and its story would be told in the lives it touched, the battles fought, and the choices made under the weight of history. The whisper of conflict was no longer a murmur, it was a deafening roar. The night was cold and still on April 2, 1982, when the first shadows crept ashore on the Falklands. Argentine forces, well prepared and determined, began Operation Rosario with precision. In the dim light, they moved silently through the darkness, their breaths misting in the frigid air. For the small British garrison stationed on the islands, it was the beginning of a battle they had not expected, one they were ill-equipped to fight. Lieutenant Mike Norman and his Royal Marines watched from their outpost as unfamiliar figures emerged from the shadows. The distant crack of rifle fire echoed in the stillness, a sound that sent a chill through even the most seasoned soldiers. For weeks, whispers of Argentine ambitions had circulated, but no one believed they would act so boldly. Now, those whispers became reality, as soldiers in foreign uniforms raised their rifles against the British flag. In Stanley, the island's sleepy capital, residents awoke to chaos. The streets filled with the heavy rumble of military vehicles and the sharp commands of Argentine officers. For decades, the Falklanders had lived in relative peace, their lives shaped by the isolation and harsh beauty of their home. Now, that peace was shattered. Some stayed indoors, peering through curtains, while others ventured out, seeking answers amidst the turmoil. By dawn, the British garrison had surrendered. Norman and his men, vastly outnumbered and outgunned, had done all they could. The Union Jack was lowered, and the blue and white Argentine flag took its place. For the first time in over a century, the Falklands were under foreign control. In Buenos Aires, the news was celebrated with triumphant fervor. But for the Falklanders and the British government, it was the beginning of a long and bitter fight. In London, the news struck like a thunderclap. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, known for her steely resolve, convened an emergency meeting. Around her, military advisors and government officials debated the next steps. The loss of the Falklands was not just a strategic defeat, it was a blow to British pride. Thatcher's voice was clear and unwavering: "We will not let this stand." The decision to deploy a task force was swift. Ships from across the Royal Navy were ready, supplies loaded, and personnel briefed. In ports across the United Kingdom, sailors and Marines bid hurried farewells to their families. For many, the journey ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. The South Atlantic was a world away, its waters treacherous, its weather unforgiving. But orders were orders, and the men and women of the fleet were determined to do their duty. On the deck of HMS Hermes, the fleet's flagship, Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward surveyed the preparations. The aircraft carrier, brimming with Harrier jets and helicopters, would play a pivotal role in the coming campaign. Around her, destroyers, frigates, and support ships formed the backbone of the task force. Woodward knew the challenges ahead were immense. The Argentine forces had dug in, and their air force was formidable. But the British fleet carried with it the weight of a nation's determination. As the fleet set sail, the mood was a mix of solemnity and resolve. The soldiers and sailors knew they were embarking on a mission that would test their limits. For the Falklanders, it was a lifeline; for the British government, it was a matter of national honor. And for the Argentine occupiers, it was the beginning of an end they did not yet foresee. Far to the south, in the icy waters near Thule Island, the Corbeta Uruguay station operated in relative isolation. The small team of Argentine personnel stationed there went about their daily routines, unaware of the growing storm. They monitored the weather, maintained the base, and sent reports back to Buenos Aires. The South Sandwich Islands, remote and harsh, seemed an unlikely setting for a confrontation. Yet, even here, the war began to take root. In hushed tones, the station's leader, Captain Alfredo Astiz, spoke to his men about their role in the conflict. Though the South Sandwich Islands were far from the main theater of war, they were symbolic of Argentina's claim to the South Atlantic. To abandon the station was unthinkable, yet to defend it seemed an impossible task. For the British, Thule Island was a final outpost of defiance. Intelligence reports suggested that the station was lightly manned, but its presence was a thorn in the side of the British campaign. Plans began to form in the corridors of military command. If the Falklands were to be reclaimed, then the South Sandwich Islands could not be ignored. As the days passed, the icebound station became a quiet battleground of nerves and resolve. The men stationed there braced for the inevitable, their thoughts turning to home and family. In London, the final orders were signed. Operation Keyhole was about to begin. In the bustling planning rooms of Whitehall, Operation Keyhole began to take shape. British military strategists pored over maps of the South Sandwich Islands, their fingers tracing the icy contours of Thule Island. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Corbeta Uruguay station was manned by a small Argentine team, but the extreme weather and remoteness of the island made the operation uniquely challenging. Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward's voice was steady as he addressed the task force. "This mission isn't about numbers, it's about precision. The enemy is entrenched, but they are isolated. The island itself is as much an adversary as the Argentine forces. We will strike with speed and decisiveness." Around him, officers nodded, their faces a blend of resolve and apprehension. The composition of the task force was critical. HMS Yarmouth and HMS Endurance were assigned as the primary vessels, their crews briefed extensively on the operation. Marines from 42 Commando would carry out the ground assault, supported by reconnaissance teams already skilled in operating in extreme environments. The inclusion of helicopters ensured a swift and flexible approach, a necessity in such harsh conditions. As final preparations were made, the weight of the mission hung heavy. There was no room for error. The success of Operation Keyhole would not only signal the reclaiming of British territory but would also be a symbolic blow to Argentine morale. The task force set its course south, their path shrouded by icy winds and a veil of secrecy. After days of navigating the icy waters of the South Atlantic, the task force sighted the forbidding silhouette of Thule Island. Shrouded in mist and surrounded by icebergs, the island seemed otherworldly, a place untouched by time. For the men aboard HMS Yarmouth and HMS Endurance, it was a stark reminder of the challenges ahead. As the ships approached, the reconnaissance teams prepared to land. The mission required absolute stealth. Any misstep could alert the Argentine defenders and jeopardize the operation. In small inflatable boats, the Royal Marines slipped through the frigid waters, their breaths visible in the freezing air. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic lapping of waves against the hulls. Once ashore, the team moved quickly, their boots crunching on the icy ground. The conditions were brutal, temperatures plummeted below -20 degrees Celsius, with winds howling at over 60 miles per hour. Yet, the Marines pressed on, driven by duty in the knowledge that failure was not an option. Through their binoculars, they could see the distant glow of lights from the Corbeta Uruguay station, a beacon in the desolate expanse. Back aboard the ships, the crews waited anxiously for the signal to proceed. Helicopters were prepped for deployment, and the task force's firepower was ready to respond if needed. Every man knew that the success of the mission hinged on the element of surprise. As night fell over Thule Island, the stage was set for the final confrontation. The morning of June 20, 1982, dawned with a bone-chilling wind sweeping across Thule Island. The Royal Marines, having established positions overnight, observed the Argentine station from their concealed vantage points. The tension was palpable as they awaited their orders to advance. On HMS Yarmouth, the crew initiated a show of force. The ship's gun fired several rounds into the icy waters near the station, a calculated move to demonstrate British resolve. Helicopters from HMS Endurance flew low over the base, their presence a stark reminder of the firepower hovering just out of sight. The Argentine personnel below watched with growing unease, their confidence wavering in the face of an overwhelming display. By midday, the decision was made. Captain Alfredo Astiz, the Argentine officer in charge, stepped outside the station with a white flag in hand. The Royal Marines advanced cautiously, weapons at the ready, until they were face to face with the surrendering Argentines. There was no resistance, only resignation. The British soldiers, who had once lowered the Union Jack on South Georgia in defeat, now raised it triumphantly over Thule Island. The surrender was formalized aboard HMS Endurance, where Astiz and his men signed the necessary documents under the watchful eyes of British commanders. The war, at least in this remote corner of the world, was over. The task force began preparations to evacuate the prisoners and secure the station. For the men of Operation Keyhole, it was a moment of quiet victory, a testament to precision, resolve, and the unyielding spirit of those who served. Aboard the tanker RFA Almeida, the atmosphere was heavy as the 10 prisoners captured during Operation Keyhole were brought aboard. 9 Argentine military personnel and 1 civilian, their faces a mix of exhaustion and defeat, were escorted under guard to the ship's makeshift holding area. For them, the war was over, but the journey home to an uncertain reception in Argentina had just begun. The British crew treated the prisoners with professional courtesy. Warm meals and blankets were provided, a stark contrast to the freezing conditions they had endured on Thule Island. For many of the captives, the silence of the open sea offered time for reflection. The civilian, a technician from the Corbeta Uruguay station, spoke quietly with a British officer, recounting his role in the station's operations and his relief at the peaceful surrender. Meanwhile, the Royal Marines who had secured the island returned to the ships. Their stoic expressions betrayed a mix of pride and exhaustion. In their minds, the operation had been a success, not a single shot fired in anger, no lives lost. Yet, they knew the war's scars would linger, not just for the captured but for everyone involved. As the task force turned toward safer waters, the prisoners looked out at the endless expanse of sea. For them, Thule Island was already fading into memory, a cold and distant outpost that had briefly been the center of a conflict much larger than themselves. In London, the announcement of the successful recapture of Thule Island was met with quiet relief. The Falklands War had officially ended days earlier, but Operation Keyhole marked the final act in reclaiming British territory. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher received the news in her office, a rare smile breaking her usual stoic demeanor. "They've done it," she said simply, turning to her advisors. The press spun the operation into a narrative of triumph and precision, highlighting the professionalism of the Royal Marines and the Navy. Headlines spoke of a clean, bloodless victory in the harshest of conditions. For a nation that had followed the Falklands War with bated breath, the news was a balm for the wounds inflicted by the conflict. Across the United Kingdom, families of servicemen who had been part of the task force waited eagerly for their loved ones to return. Letters began arriving from the South Atlantic, recounting tales of freezing winds, desolate landscapes, and the surreal nature of raising the Union Jack over a remote speck of land in the ocean. In Argentina, the reaction was muted. The loss of Thule Island was symbolic of a larger defeat, one that had shaken the nation's leadership and morale. For the families of the captured men, the news brought a mix of relief and sadness. Their sons, brothers, and fathers would return, but not as victors. The task force sailed north, leaving the icy reaches of the South Sandwich Islands behind. The ships moved at a steady pace, the cold, turbulent waters gradually giving way to calmer seas. On deck, sailors and Marines reflected on their mission, the stark beauty of the South Atlantic etched in their memories. For many, Operation Keyhole had been their first deployment in such harsh and remote conditions. The challenges they faced, freezing temperatures, isolation, and the constant threat of the unknown, had tested their resolve. Yet, they carried a sense of pride, knowing they had played a part in bringing the war to its definitive conclusion. As the ships neared the Falklands, they passed by familiar landmarks. Mount Kent, Goose Green, and Port Stanley, names that had become synonymous with courage and sacrifice during the war. The sailors saluted silently as they sailed past, a tribute to the battles fought and lives lost. Upon reaching Stanley, the task force docked briefly, allowing the men to stretch their legs and breathe in the cool island air. For the locals, the sight of British ships in the harbor was a comfort, a reminder that their lives were slowly returning to normal. Back in Britain, the Falklands War had left its mark. Public opinion was a mix of pride and introspection. The war had showcased the strength and determination of the British armed forces, but it had also highlighted the fragility of far-flung territories in a modern world. In Parliament, debates raged about the cost of the war, both in lives and resources. Yet, there was consensus on one point: the men and women who had served deserved recognition. Plans for medals and honors were set in motion, ensuring that the bravery of those who fought, from Goose Green to Thule Island, would not be forgotten. For the families of the servicemen, the end of the war brought relief and celebration. Towns across the UK held parades and gatherings to welcome their heroes home. The stories shared, of camaraderie, hardship, and resilience, became part of the fabric of the nation's history. As the weeks turned to months, the Falklands themselves began to rebuild. The scars of war were evident, but so too was the determination of the islanders to move forward. For them, the return of British sovereignty was more than a political victory, it was a reaffirmation of their identity and way of life. The aftermath of the Falklands War left the islands bruised but not broken. In Port Stanley, residents worked tirelessly to repair their homes and businesses damaged by the conflict. Roads riddled with craters, fences torn by artillery, and fields marked with unexploded ordnance were somber reminders of the battles fought. Yet, the islanders' resilience shone brightly. Farmers returned to their sheep, carefully avoiding areas still marked as dangerous. Schools reopened, their walls still bearing scars from the war. Children played in the streets again, their laughter a testament to life's ability to persevere even in the shadow of destruction. For many Falklanders, the return of British soldiers and sailors to their shores was a source of comfort and hope. The British government swiftly moved to strengthen its position on the islands. Construction began on a new airfield at Mount Pleasant, providing a permanent military presence to deter future threats. Diplomats worked to solidify the international perception of British sovereignty over the Falklands, knowing that political recognition would be as critical as military might in securing the island's future. Meanwhile, efforts to clear mines left behind by the Argentines became a priority. Teams of engineers carefully swept the land, their work slow and meticulous. For the Falklanders, each cleared field represented a step closer to reclaiming their homeland. As the British consolidated their position in the Falklands, attention turned briefly to the South Sandwich Islands. The Corbetta Uruguay station on Thule Island, now under British control, was a point of curiosity. Few outside the military knew of the station's existence before the war, and fewer still had any sense of its role in the broader conflict. A small team of British personnel was stationed on Thule to monitor the facility and its surrounding area. They lived in isolation, their days marked by routine maintenance and occasional radio contact with the outside world. The stark beauty of the island, with its icy cliffs and snow-covered terrain, provided a strange sense of peace. Reports from the station were sparse but consistent. The Argentines had left behind little of value, a few pieces of equipment, personal belongings, and records of their meteorological research. For the British government, the importance of Thule Island lay not in its physical assets but in its symbolic value. Its recapture had been a clear message: no part of British territory would be left undefended. Across the Atlantic, the war's impact rippled through the lives of those who had fought and those left behind. In Buenos Aires, Captain Alfredo Astiz faced a mixed reception upon his return. To some, he was a scapegoat for Argentina's defeat; to others, a man who had done his duty in impossible circumstances. For the families of the men stationed at Corbetta, Uruguay, the relief of their loved one's safe return was tempered by the weight of national disappointment. In Britain, Sergeant Andrew Lane of 42 Commando returned home to his family. His children, too young to fully understand the war, clung to his legs as he stepped through the door. Lane spoke little of his time on Thule Island, preferring to focus on the life he had fought to protect. But in quiet moments, he would recall the freezing winds, the tense negotiations, and the moment he watched the Union Jack rise once more. For Lieutenant Sarah Wilson, a naval officer aboard HMS Endurance, the experience had been transformative. As one of the few women involved in the operation, she had faced skepticism from some but had proven herself time and again. The icy seas of the South Atlantic had tested her resolve, but they had also reinforced her belief in her abilities. Wilson returned to her post with a sense of pride and a determination to rise further in the ranks. Operation Keyhole, while a relatively small part of the larger Falklands campaign, became a case study for military strategists. The success of the operation was attributed to meticulous planning, adaptability, and the ability to operate effectively in extreme conditions. In military academies across the UK, young officers studied the operation. They analyzed the reconnaissance efforts, the coordination between naval and ground forces, and the psychological impact of the operation's show of force. For many, Operation Keyhole was a reminder of the value of precision over brute strength. But the operation also raised questions. Could more have been done to prevent the conflict from escalating? Were the resources dedicated to Thule Island justified by its strategic importance? These debates echoed in the halls of power, shaping future policy on the defense of remote territories. Years later, Thule Island remained as remote and desolate as ever. The Corbetta Uruguay station, long abandoned, stood as a frozen monument to the war. Its red-painted buildings, now weathered and worn, were visited only by occasional research teams and passing naval patrols. For those who had served there, the island held a strange significance. It was a place of stark beauty and harsh realities, a setting for one of the final acts of a bitter conflict. Its memory lingered in quiet moments, a photograph on a mantelpiece, a story shared over a drink, a medal carefully preserved in a drawer. As the Falklands and their surrounding islands settled into a hard-won peace, the story of Operation Keyhole became a small but enduring part of the greater narrative. It was a testament to the resolve of a nation, the sacrifices of its people, and the enduring spirit of those who fought to protect what they held dear. The Red Line, Operation MANTA, and the Chadian-Libyan conflict. In the blistering heat of the Chadian desert, where the sands whisper secrets of ancient struggles, a modern conflict brewed in the early 1980s. Chad, a landlocked nation straddling the line between North and Sub-Saharan Africa, found itself caught in the crosshairs of political intrigue, rebellion, and international power plays. The year was 1983, and the desert winds carried with them the echoes of war. France, long past its colonial ambitions, faced a dilemma that would test its resolve and reshape its role on the world stage. This is the story of Operation MANTA, a military intervention that drew a literal and figurative line in the sand. The roots of the conflict stretched back decades. Chad, a mosaic of ethnic groups and clans, had been embroiled in civil war since 1965. The fragile peace brokered by international mediators in 1979 created the Transitional Government of National Unity, GUNI, but unity proved elusive. By 1982, Hissène Habré, a ruthless and ambitious leader, had seized the capital, N'Djamena, forcing his rival Gukuni Uwedai to regroup in the northern desert. Habré's rise to power was marked by brutality, but it also symbolized hope for stability among his supporters. Gukuni, meanwhile, forged alliances with Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, whose ambitions extended beyond Chad. Gaddafi's support for Gukuni was not merely ideological, it was strategic, aimed at expanding Libya's influence across the Sahel. The French, wary of Gaddafi's ambitions, watched these developments with growing concern. President François Mitterrand faced a choice: intervene or risk a destabilized Chad falling entirely under Libyan control. As rebel forces, bolstered by Libyan troops, marched southward, the stage was set for a confrontation that would define the region's future. June 1983 marked a turning point. Libyan-backed forces, equipped with advanced weaponry and supported by airstrikes, captured the strategic oasis town of Fayal-Arjo. The victory sent shockwaves through Chad and its allies. France, initially reluctant to intervene, faced mounting pressure to act. The fall of Fayal-Arjo cut off vital supply lines and positioned the rebels dangerously close to N'Djamena. In Paris, the debate raged. Mitterrand, under fire from both hawks and doves within his government, sought to balance France's historical ties to Chad with its aversion to direct military entanglements. The bombing of Fayal-Arjo by Libyan jets proved decisive. French Foreign Minister Claude Chassin declared that France could not stand idly by while Libya violated Chad's sovereignty. By July, France committed 3,500 troops to Chad, the largest deployment since the colonial era. Codenamed Operation MANTA, the mission was not to reclaim lost territories but to establish a defensive line along the 15th parallel, the Red Line. This boundary symbolized France's determination to halt Libyan expansion while avoiding direct confrontation. Among the French troops deployed to Chad was Captain Julien Moreau, a seasoned officer with memories of Algeria etched into his psyche. Moreau viewed this mission as a chance to prevent another colonial-style debacle. In contrast, Corporal Antoine Lefebvre, fresh out of training, saw the deployment as an adventure, unaware of the harsh realities that awaited him in the desert. On the other side, Fatima, a nurse in the rebel-held north, struggled to provide care in makeshift clinics. Her brother, Ahmed, fought alongside Goukouni's forces, driven by a mix of loyalty and survival. Their lives, though distant, were bound by the invisible threads of war, each decision rippling across the desert sands. As French forces dug in along the Red Line, the tension mounted. Libyan reconnaissance flights tested French resolve, and the desert nights echoed with the distant sound of artillery. Yet, an uneasy stalemate prevailed. Neither side dared to cross the line, aware that one misstep could ignite a larger conflagration. The creation of the Red Line brought a semblance of order to the chaos. French troops fortified positions, establishing a series of bases and airstrips to monitor Libyan movements. The presence of Mirage jets patrolling the skies sent a clear message: France was prepared to defend its allies. For Habré, the French intervention was a lifeline. His forces, though resilient, lacked the resources to withstand a prolonged assault. French logistical support and intelligence sharing bolstered his position, allowing him to regroup and stabilize his government. Meanwhile, Gaddafi's ambitions were temporarily checked. The Libyan leader, calculating and pragmatic, avoided direct confrontation with French forces. Instead, he focused on consolidating control in northern Chad, effectively partitioning the country. This de facto division created a fragile equilibrium, but the underlying tensions remained unresolved. The desert sun bore down relentlessly, turning the sands into a searing expanse of gold and heat. Along the Red Line, French soldiers adapted to their harsh new environment. The line was fortified with barbed wire, observation posts, and defensive perimeters, creating a stronghold against potential incursions. But as days turned to weeks, the real battle was one of endurance. For Captain Julien Moreau, the monotony was a test of leadership. His men faced not only the threat of Libyan and GUN forces but also the psychological toll of isolation. Letters from home became treasures, small reminders of a world beyond the conflict. Moreau found himself becoming both a commander and a confidant, helping his troops navigate the challenges of war. In the north, Gaddafi's forces strategized. The Libyan leader was aware of the risks of direct confrontation with France but sought to weaken the resolve of his adversaries through propaganda and covert operations. Reports of supply routes being sabotaged and skirmishes near the Red Line kept the French on edge. The tension was palpable, yet the stalemate persisted. For Fatima and her brother Ahmed, life in the rebel-controlled north grew increasingly precarious. The once promised support from Libya seemed inconsistent, and the brutal conditions of the desert strained both morale and resources. Fatima worried about Ahmed, whose determination to fight often seemed to outpace his caution. Their world felt trapped between the ambitions of leaders far removed from their daily struggles. One clear morning, the calm of the desert was shattered by the roar of Mirage jets. A Libyan reconnaissance plane had ventured too close to the Red Line, prompting a swift response from French forces. The engagement was brief but decisive, a stark reminder to Libya that the Red Line was not merely symbolic. The incident emboldened Habrés forces, who began mounting small-scale offensives against GUNT positions north of the line. These skirmishes tested the limits of the stalemate. While France remained cautious not to overextend, Habré saw an opportunity to regain momentum. He directed his forces with calculated aggression, determined to shift the balance of power. Meanwhile, the French airbase at N'Djamena became a hub of activity. Pilots like Lieutenant Pierre Garnier found themselves thrust into the center of a geopolitical chess game. Garnier, though young, carried the weight of every mission with stoic determination. The sight of Libyan troops retreating from airstrikes gave him a sense of purpose but also raised questions about the broader consequences of their actions. The escalation in the skies reverberated on the ground. Fatima's clinic, already struggling with limited supplies, was overwhelmed by casualties from recent clashes. Each patient she treated reminded her of the human cost of the conflict. Ahmed, too, began to question his path, torn between his loyalty to the cause and the toll it exacted on his family. As 1984 approached, the stalemate showed no signs of breaking. The international community began pushing for a diplomatic resolution. French President François Mitterrand and Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi engaged in cautious negotiations, seeking a way to de-escalate the conflict without losing face. The talks were fraught with tension. France insisted on a mutual withdrawal of foreign troops from Chad, while Gaddafi sought to retain influence over the north. The resulting agreement, signed in September, outlined the withdrawal of both French and Libyan forces. It seemed a fragile peace was within reach. But on the ground, skepticism abounded. Captain Moreau and his men prepared for the possibility that Gaddafi might not honor the accord. In rebel-held areas, fighters like Ahmed viewed the agreement as a betrayal, fearing it would leave them vulnerable to Habrés forces. Fatima, ever pragmatic, focused on treating those in need, knowing that promises made by leaders often took months or years to materialize. For many, the negotiations represented hope, a chance to end the suffering and rebuild. But the shadow of uncertainty loomed large over the desert sands, threatening to unravel the fragile progress achieved. The ink on the September 1984 agreement was barely dry when doubts began to surface. France made good on its promise, withdrawing troops from Chad in a gradual but orderly manner. The Red Line, once bristling with defenses and soldiers, grew quieter with each passing week. For Captain Moreau and his men, the departure was bittersweet. While the prospect of returning home was welcome, the fragile situation left many uneasy. Libya, however, was less consistent. While Gaddafi publicly endorsed the withdrawal agreement, reports of continued Libyan presence in northern Chad soon surfaced. Satellite imagery and intelligence reports pointed to fortified positions beyond the Al-Yuzu Strip. Gaddafi seemed intent on maintaining his foothold, challenging the credibility of the accord. In N'Djamena, Hissène Habré moved quickly to consolidate power. French support had bought him time to rebuild his forces, but the withdrawal left his administration vulnerable. He intensified recruitment efforts, calling on young Chadians to defend their sovereignty. For Ahmed, the call to arms was both an opportunity and a curse. Torn between loyalty to his people and disillusionment with the unending war, he reluctantly rejoined the fight. Fatima, meanwhile, found herself increasingly isolated. With resources dwindling, her clinic struggled to stay operational. The withdrawal of French aid exacerbated the crisis, forcing her to make difficult choices. Each life saved felt like a small victory in an otherwise overwhelming struggle. As 1985 dawned, the fragile peace gave way to renewed tensions. Libyan forces, emboldened by France's departure, began probing the southern territories. Skirmishes erupted near the Old Red Line, testing the resolve of Habré's troops. The ceasefire, once heralded as a breakthrough, now seemed a distant memory. For Lieutenant Pierre Garnier, now stationed in Paris, the news was disheartening. Having flown countless missions over the Chadian desert, he had witnessed the determination of both sides firsthand. His quiet life back in France felt hollow compared to the urgency of the conflict he had left behind. Garnier wrote to his former comrades, urging them to remain vigilant and prepared for a potential return. In the north, Ahmed found himself caught in a brutal campaign to push back Libyan forces. The battles were fierce and unforgiving, with casualties mounting on both sides. Fatima, despite the risks, traveled closer to the front lines to provide medical aid. Her unwavering commitment to saving lives made her a beacon of hope for the wounded, even as the violence spiraled out of control. The conflict began to attract international attention once more. The United States, wary of Gaddafi's growing influence, began supporting Habré's government with military supplies and intelligence. The stage was being set for a broader confrontation, one that would draw more players into the already complex chessboard of Chadian politics. By mid-1986, the situation reached a breaking point. Gaddafi's refusal to fully withdraw and his continued provocations south of the Al-Yuzu Strip prompted renewed calls for French intervention. President Mitterrand, under pressure from international allies and his military advisors, authorized a new operation, EPERVIER. Unlike MANTA, this mission aimed to decisively expel Libyan forces from Chad. The return of French forces brought mixed reactions. For Habré, it was a lifeline that reinvigorated his campaign. For the Chadian people, it was both a relief and a reminder of their dependence on foreign powers. Fatima, ever pragmatic, prepared for the influx of wounded that the renewed fighting would surely bring. Captain Moreau, recalled to active duty, found himself once again in the unforgiving Chadian desert. His mission was clear: support Habré's forces while avoiding a full-scale war with Libya. The French strategy hinged on precision airstrikes and coordinated ground operations, leveraging their superior technology to outmaneuver the Libyans. In one of the operation's early skirmishes, Ahmed faced the terrifying might of Mirage jets strafing Libyan positions. The sight of the French forces, once perceived as distant, now loomed large in his world. Fatima, tending to survivors in the aftermath, wondered if peace was ever truly possible in a land so deeply scarred by war. The skies over Chad roared with the engines of Mirage jets as Operation EPERVIER commenced in early 1987. This new French intervention was designed to decisively shift the balance of power. Unlike the defensive posture of Operation MANTA, EPERVIER's mandate was offensive, to push Libyan forces out of Chad entirely, leaving no room for ambiguity. Captain Moreau, now commanding a mixed force of French and Chadian troops, led a key mission to secure an airstrip near Faylargeau. The area, once a symbol of Libyan dominance, was heavily fortified. Moreau's tactical acumen was put to the test as his team coordinated a ground assault under the cover of French airstrikes. The operation's success was swift but not without cost. Heavy casualties on both sides underscored the human toll of the conflict. For Ahmed, now a battle-hardened soldier, the retreat of Libyan forces brought both relief and a deepening sense of futility. He had seen too many comrades fall and questioned whether the land they fought for would ever know peace. Fatima's clinic became a haven for the injured. Each new patient brought stories of valor and despair, and she worked tirelessly to stitch together not just bodies but the fraying fabric of her community. Her resolve inspired others, even as the war's shadow loomed large. The liberation of Faylargeau marked a turning point. Libyan forces, facing relentless pressure, began retreating northward. The Chadian troops, emboldened by their successes and supported by French logistics, launched a series of offensives. The battles that followed were fierce, with both sides vying for control of critical supply routes. Ahmed found himself leading a small unit tasked with disrupting Libyan supply lines. The mission was perilous, involving long treks through hostile terrain and the constant threat of ambush. Yet, Ahmed's leadership earned him the respect of his men, who saw in him a quiet determination that mirrored their own. In Paris, news of the operation's success buoyed public opinion. Lieutenant Garnier, now working in an advisory role at the French Ministry of Defense, felt a bittersweet pride. He longed to be back in the field but understood the importance of ensuring the mission's strategic coherence. Garnier's detailed reports helped shape the next phase of the campaign, which aimed to corner Libyan forces near the Al-Yuzu Strip. For Fatima, the tide of war seemed unending. While the battles moved north, the influx of displaced civilians brought new challenges to her doorstep. She coordinated with international aid organizations to secure supplies, all while maintaining the fragile hope that the fighting would soon end. As Libyan forces retreated, Habrés' army launched what would become known as the Toyota War, named for the light, fast-moving Toyota pickup trucks that carried Chadian troops across the desert. The mobility and ingenuity of these vehicles gave Habrés forces a significant advantage, allowing them to outmaneuver the heavily mechanized Libyan army. Captain Moreau marveled at the adaptability of his Chadian allies. What they lacked in resources, they made up for in creativity and determination. Moreau's role shifted to providing air support and coordinating intelligence, ensuring that the Chadians maintained their momentum. Ahmed, now a seasoned fighter, led one such Toyota-mounted unit in a daring raid on a Libyan supply depot. The mission was a resounding success, crippling Libyan logistics and further demoralizing their troops. But the cost was high. Several of Ahmed's closest comrades were lost in the raid, leaving scars that no victory could erase. Fatima received word of Ahmed's survival through a fellow fighter, but the news was bittersweet. She had begun to fear that the war would consume them both, leaving little of the life they had once dreamed of. Still, she pressed on, her hands steady even as her heart ached. By mid-1987, Libyan forces were in full retreat. The decisive battles near the Al-Yuzu Strip marked the beginning of the end for Gaddafi's campaign in Chad. French airstrikes and Chadian ground offensives dismantled Libyan strongholds, forcing a complete withdrawal from the region. For Captain Moreau, the victory was a testament to the resilience of both the French and Chadian forces. Yet, he couldn't shake the weight of lives lost along the way. As his deployment neared its end, he reflected on the fragile peace they had fought to secure and the scars that would linger long after the war. Ahmed, now a reluctant hero, returned to his village to find it irrevocably changed. The war had taken friends, family, and a sense of innocence that could never be reclaimed. Fatima, who had managed to keep the clinic running through sheer willpower, welcomed him with open arms. Their reunion was marked by a shared understanding of the sacrifices made and the hope that their land might finally heal. In Paris, Lieutenant Garnier penned his final report on Operation EPERVIER. He concluded with a somber acknowledgement of the complexities of intervention. While the mission had achieved its goals, the questions of Chad's future and the long-term consequences of foreign involvement remained unanswered. As 1987 drew to a close, the Chadian desert began to quiet. The Libyan forces, battered and broken, had retreated entirely, leaving behind empty bases and the echoes of their ambitions. Operation EPERVIER had achieved its goal, but the scars of war remained etched into the land and its people. For Captain Moreau, the return to France was bittersweet. The camaraderie of his unit, forged in the crucible of conflict, was something he knew he might never experience again. He left behind a country still grappling with the aftermath of war and returned to one grappling with questions about its role in the post-colonial world. Ahmed, too, struggled to find peace. The village he called home was a shadow of its former self. Many of its inhabitants had fled during the fighting, and those who remained were scarred by loss. Fatima encouraged him to find solace in rebuilding, urging him to use his leadership skills for the good of the community. Together, they began to piece together what little they had left, finding small victories in every repaired roof and every planted field. In N'Djamena, Hissène Habré consolidated his grip on power. Triumphant on the battlefield, he turned his attention to eliminating internal dissent. His regime grew increasingly repressive, casting a shadow over the hard-won peace. Those who had fought for Chad's freedom now questioned what that freedom truly meant. For Fatima, the end of the war brought a new set of challenges. Her clinic, once a lifeline for soldiers and civilians alike, became a place of healing for the many who bore invisible wounds. She worked tirelessly to expand its reach, appealing to international organizations for funding and support. Her resilience became a symbol of hope for the village. Ahmed, now her partner in both life and purpose, struggled to reconcile his experiences on the battlefield with the quiet life he was trying to build. Nightmares of the war haunted him, and he often found himself retreating into solitude. Fatima, understanding his pain, encouraged him to share his stories, hoping that in doing so, he might find some measure of peace. Meanwhile, Captain Moreau found himself navigating a different battlefield. Back in Paris, he was tasked with briefing political and military leaders on the lessons of Chad. His candid assessments of the war's costs and complexities made him a polarizing figure. Some saw him as a hero who had upheld France's values, others criticized him as a symbol of unwelcome interventionism. Though Libya's forces had retreated, the dispute over the Al-Uzu Strip remained unresolved. This narrow, resource-rich territory on Chad's northern border had been a flashpoint for decades. Even after the fighting stopped, its ownership was contested, fueling tensions between the two nations. In 1990, the matter was brought before the International Court of Justice. For many Chadians, this diplomatic battle was a reminder that peace was fragile and often required the same level of tenacity as war. Ahmed followed the developments with cautious hope, while Fatima focused on her growing role as a community leader. When the court finally ruled in Chad's favor in 1994, celebrations erupted across the country. The decision marked a symbolic victory, affirming the sovereignty that had been fought for so dearly. Yet, for those who had lived through the conflict, the ruling was a reminder of the sacrifices made along the way. As the years passed, Fatima's clinic grew into a regional hub for healthcare. She trained others in her techniques, ensuring that the knowledge she had gained during the war would not be lost. Her reputation extended far beyond the village, and she became a voice for reconciliation and rebuilding. Ahmed, finding solace in Fatima's unwavering strength, became a respected elder in the community. Though he rarely spoke of the war, his actions spoke volumes. He organized efforts to rebuild schools and irrigation systems, channeling his energy into creating a better future for the next generation. For Captain Moreau, retirement brought time to reflect. He often thought of the Red Line and the desert sands, of the comrades he had lost and the people of Chad who had shown such resilience. He began writing a memoir, hoping to capture the complexities of the war and the lessons it offered. The conflict that had defined Chad for decades slowly gave way to new challenges and opportunities. The scars of war remained, but the nation began to look forward. Infrastructure projects connected remote regions, schools reopened, and a generation of young Chadians grew up without the constant threat of violence. Fatima and Ahmed, now surrounded by children and grandchildren, often spoke of the war not with bitterness, but as a reminder of what they had endured and overcome. Their story became part of the oral history of their village, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In Paris, Captain Moreau's memoir was published to critical acclaim. Titled The Red Line, Stories from the Chadian Desert, it became a touchstone for discussions about intervention, sovereignty, and the cost of war. Moreau, ever humble, viewed it not as a personal achievement, but as a way to honor those who had lived through the conflict. The story of Operation EPERVIER. The year was 1986, and the deserts of Chad simmered under an unforgiving sun. Beneath its vast skies, a shadow loomed over the Sahel, a shadow of war and ambition. Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, sought to expand his influence southward, while Chad, fractured by years of internal strife, teetered on the brink of collapse. The world watched as the conflict spiraled into a stage for regional power plays. Amid this turmoil, France, bound by historic ties and strategic interests, prepared to intervene under the banner of Operation EPERVIER. N'Djamena, Chad's capital, stood vulnerable. To the north, the Libyan-backed forces had crossed the 16th parallel, their tanks carving paths through arid terrain. Civilians whispered of impending doom, while soldiers braced for the battles to come. It was a time of uncertainty, a time when alliances would be tested and destinies forged. In this crucible of conflict, lives from disparate corners of the world intertwined, Chadian villagers, French pilots, Libyan soldiers, and international observers. Each carried their own hopes and fears, their stories forming the fabric of a war that would span decades. It began with an ominous meeting in N'Djamena's government palace. Chadian President Hissène Habre, a man hardened by years of conflict, met with French Defense Minister Paul Quilles. The air was thick with tension as the two leaders discussed the Libyan threat. Gaddafi's forces had seized control of northern Chad, their sights set on advancing further. France, Habre knew, was his country's last hope. Quilles wasted no time. Operation EPERVIER will ensure Chad's sovereignty, he declared. His words carried the weight of a nation's military might. By February 13, French Mirage jets roared into action, targeting Libya's key airbase at Wadi Dum. The strike was swift and precise, sending a clear message to Gaddafi. In the villages near the front lines, the sound of explosions echoed like distant thunder. Civilians hurriedly packed their belongings, fleeing southward. Among them was a young boy named Idris, whose family had lived in the same mud-brick home for generations. Now, they faced an uncertain journey, their lives uprooted by a war they did not choose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, French and Chadian forces prepared for the next phase. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by the hum of military vehicles and the whispers of soldiers. For many, it was the calm before the storm, a moment to reflect on the battles that lay ahead. The French Air Force took to the skies on February 16, 1986, with their mission clear, cripple Libya's capacity for further aggression. 6 Mirage F-1S and 4 Jaguar fighter bombers streaked over the golden sands, their sleek forms glinting under the desert sun. Below, Libyan troops entrenched in the strategic Wadi Doum air base scrambled in confusion as the French jets unleashed their payloads. Explosions shook the earth, tearing apart vital runways and rendering the base almost useless. Smoke billowed into the sky, a dark plume visible for miles. In N'Djamena, Chadian civilians watched anxiously, unsure whether this display of force would deter the advancing Libyan forces or provoke an even fiercer response. Meanwhile, in Tripoli, Gaddafi fumed at the news. He ordered immediate retaliation. Just a day later, a Libyan Tu-22 bomber took off, its mission to strike N'Djamena airport. But fate had its own plans. The bomber never returned, likely downed by technical failure or ground fire. For the French and Chadians, this was a small but significant victory. In the desert camp near the capital, French commandos fortified their positions. Among them was Captain Pierre Dumont, a seasoned officer with a reputation for calm under pressure. "We've sent a message today," Dumont told his men. But the war has only just begun. To the northwest, the rugged Tibesti Mountains stood as both a sanctuary and a battlefield. These jagged peaks had long sheltered rebel forces, their labyrinthine terrain a nightmare for conventional armies. It was here that Goukouni Ouediaï, former Chadian leader turned rebel commander, staged his resistance against Gaddafi's forces. The People's Armed Forces, Goukouni's militia, were vastly outnumbered. Libyan forces deployed 8,000 troops to crush the rebellion, but the terrain proved as much an enemy as the rebels themselves. Sandstorms swept through the mountain passes, reducing visibility to mere meters. Supplies ran thin, and morale faltered on both sides. In September 1986, under the cover of darkness, French Transall aircraft flew low over the Tibesti. They parachuted critical supplies, gasoline, food, and anti-tank missiles, into rebel hands. It was a lifeline for Goukouni's men, who used the new weaponry to strike back with renewed ferocity. In the small village of Bardai, nestled in the mountains, the local elders gathered to discuss the escalating conflict. For them, this war was a curse, bringing bloodshed and hardship to their once quiet lives. Yet even here, hope flickered. Perhaps, one elder mused, this foreign intervention will finally bring peace. As 1987 dawned, the war shifted southward. Habrés forces, bolstered by French support, launched a daring offensive to reclaim the Ennedi Plateau. Their target, the Libyan stronghold of Fada. The battle began in early January, with Chadian troops surging forward in battered Toyota trucks armed with heavy machine guns. The Libyan defenders, confident in their superior firepower, were caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the Chadian assault. In just a few hours, Fada fell, leaving nearly 800 Libyan soldiers dead and hundreds more captured. It was a resounding victory, one that would go down in history as a turning point in the Chadian-Libyan conflict. But Gaddafi was not one to back down. In retaliation, his forces bombed the towns of Arada and Calais, crossing the so-called Red Line at the 16th parallel. French forces, stationed in Calais, narrowly escaped unscathed. The incident marked the first direct attack on the French contingent, signaling a dangerous escalation in the conflict. In Paris, political leaders debated their next move. Back in the Sahel, soldiers like Captain Dumont prepared for the worst. This isn't just a war for Chad, Dumont reflected. It's a war for the future of the region. By March 1987, the battle for Chad intensified as both sides vied for control of Fayalajo, a key city at the heart of the Borca region. For Gaddafi, Fayalajo was more than a strategic point, it was a gateway to further expansion. For Habra, it symbolized Chad's sovereignty. The Libyan forces fortified their positions with tanks and artillery, their confidence bolstered by sheer numbers. Yet Habra's troops, known for their resilience, had one significant advantage: speed. Riding in nimble Toyota pickups, they launched a surprise attack at dawn, catching the Libyan garrison unprepared. As gunfire echoed across the desert, Chadian soldiers used French-supplied Milan anti-tank missiles to devastating effect. Libyan armor burned in the hot sun, and their defensive lines crumbled. The battle raged for hours, leaving the sands littered with wreckage and bodies. By sunset, Fayalajo was in Chadian hands, marking another crushing blow to Gaddafi's ambitions. In a small camp outside the city, Chadian and French soldiers celebrated the victory, but the mood was somber. Many lives had been lost, and the war was far from over. Among the weary troops was Sergeant Mahamat, who quietly buried a friend that evening under the stars, whispering a promise to carry on the fight. Following the victory at Fayalajo, France escalated its involvement, determined to push Libya's forces back to the Al-Uzu Strip. On April 7, 1987, Mirage F-1 jets once again took flight, their mission to destroy Libyan supply lines and communication hubs. The operation was meticulously planned. At first light, the Mirages swept low over the desert, targeting a key convoy near the border. Explosions tore through trucks laden with ammunition and fuel, setting off a chain reaction that lit up the sky. Libyan soldiers scattered, their morale shaken by the sudden and precise assault. For French pilot Captain Julien Moreau, the mission was a reminder of the delicate balance between strategy and survival. "Every sortie is a gamble," he wrote in his journal that night. "But we fly because we must." In the village of Zur, not far from the Al-Uzu Strip, locals watched the French jets pass overhead with a mix of awe and fear. They had seen firsthand the destruction that warplanes could bring, but they also clung to the hope that this intervention would bring an end to the fighting. As the conflict dragged on, the Chadian and French forces adopted guerrilla tactics to counter Libya's overwhelming firepower. In the vast, unforgiving desert, battles became as much about endurance as firepower. Both sides suffered from the relentless heat, scarce water, and the ever-present danger of ambushes. In June 1987, a Chadian patrol stumbled upon a hidden Libyan outpost near the Ennedi Plateau. Leading the patrol was Lieutenant Suleiman, a soft-spoken but determined officer. Under the cover of darkness, his men surrounded the outpost and launched a surprise attack at dawn. The skirmish was brief but brutal, leaving the Libyan soldiers overwhelmed and forced to surrender. News of Suleiman's success spread quickly, bolstering Chadian morale. But with each victory came the sobering reality of war. Supplies were stretched thin, and every soldier knew that a single misstep could lead to disaster in the unforgiving desert. That night, around a small campfire, the men shared stories of home, their laughter masking the tension that lingered in the air. "Tomorrow, we fight again," Suleiman said, his voice steady. "But tonight, we live." By the summer of 1987, Gaddafi's forces were in retreat. Habra, emboldened by a string of victories, launched a bold campaign to reclaim the northern territories. The Toyota War, as it came to be known, became a symbol of unconventional warfare, with Chadian soldiers using mobility and surprise to outmaneuver the Libyan army. In mid-July, a decisive battle unfolded near the town of Al-Yuzu. The Libyans, heavily entrenched, believed their position was unassailable. But Habrés forces, equipped with intelligence from French reconnaissance missions, devised a daring plan to flank the enemy under the cover of a sandstorm. The storm raged as the Chadians closed in, their movements concealed by the swirling sands. When the attack came, it was swift and overwhelming. Libyan forces, disoriented and cut off from reinforcements, suffered heavy losses. By the end of the day, Al-Yuzu was back in Chadian hands, and the Libyan grip on northern Chad had been broken. In the aftermath, villagers began to return to their homes, though the scars of war were evident. Among them was Idris, now a teenager, who helped rebuild his family's home. As he worked, he listened to the stories of the soldiers who had fought to reclaim their land, their words inspiring a sense of pride and determination in the young boy. As the Chadian-Libyan conflict persisted, France established Camp Mal near Abesh to secure eastern Chad and support the Chadian forces. By August 1987, Camp Mal became a bustling hub of activity. French and Chadian soldiers worked tirelessly to fortify the base, knowing it would serve as a launchpad for future operations. Lieutenant Colonel Jean-Luc Perrin, commanding officer of the French contingent, walked the perimeter daily, inspecting the defenses. His calm demeanor inspired confidence among his men, many of whom were young recruits experiencing combat for the first time. The desert is an unforgiving ally, Perrin often reminded them. But with preparation, it can be our shield. Beyond the camp's borders, Libyan forces regrouped, determined to regain lost ground. Their spies reported the growing strength of Camp Mal, prompting Gaddafi to order a counteroffensive. Chadian scouts intercepted these plans, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would test the mettle of both sides. In the oppressive heat of the desert, the soldiers of Camp Mal trained relentlessly, their resolve hardened by the harsh environment. As one French sergeant put it, the desert teaches you patience and vigilance. It's a battlefield where the smallest mistake can cost you everything. The Libyan forces struck first, targeting the French Chadian base at Khalat. Situated on the 16th parallel, the base was a critical defensive point, and its fall would have opened the path for a Libyan advance. On the morning of September 5, 1987, Libyan artillery thundered across the desert, initiating a siege that would last for days. Inside the base, Captain Dumont coordinated the defense, his voice steady over the radio as explosions rocked the compound. "Hold your ground," he urged his men. "Reinforcements are on their way." Meanwhile, Chadian soldiers fought fiercely alongside their French allies, their unity a testament to the bonds forged in the crucible of war. Despite their superior firepower, the Libyan forces failed to breach the base's defenses. French air support arrived in the nick of time, with Mirage jets striking Libyan artillery positions and forcing a retreat. The siege was lifted, and the defenders of Khalat emerged victorious but weary. Among them was Sergeant Mahamat, who bore the scars of battle but also the pride of having defended his homeland. That night, under a clear desert sky, he wrote a letter to his family, telling them of the day's events and the hope that their sacrifices would lead to lasting peace. Even as battles raged openly, a quieter war unfolded in the shadows. French intelligence operatives worked tirelessly to gather information on Libyan movements and strategies. Among them was Agent Claire Dubois, an experienced field operative fluent in Arabic and adept at blending into local communities. Dubois had been sent to a small village near the border, where she posed as a traveling merchant. Her mission was to gather intelligence on a suspected Libyan supply route. Every day, She listened to the villagers' stories and observed the movements of armed convoys. Her notes, sent in coded messages to her handlers, proved invaluable in planning future operations. One evening, as she sat in the dimly lit corner of a tea house, she overheard a conversation between two Libyan soldiers. They spoke of an impending offensive, their voices hushed but urgent. Dubois committed every word to memory, knowing this information could save lives. Back at the French command center, her report set off a flurry of activity. Plans were quickly adjusted, and troops redeployed to counter the threat. Though her work remained in the shadows, Dubois knew that every piece of intelligence brought them one step closer to victory. Amid the chaos of war, the desert remained a silent, stoic witness. Its vastness swallowed both victories and defeats, offering no comfort to those who fought beneath its scorching sun. For centuries, the Sahel had been a land of resilience, its people enduring droughts, invasions, and now, a brutal conflict that reshaped their lives. In a remote village near the Enedi Plateau, the elder Mahmoud gathered the children around a flickering fire. His voice was steady as he recounted stories of past generations who had defended their land against foreign invaders. "The desert is our home," he said. "It is harsh, but it is also our strength." Among the children was Idris, who listened intently, his eyes reflecting the flames. He dreamed of becoming a soldier like the ones he had seen pass through his village, their uniforms dusty but their resolve unwavering. For Idris, the war was both a tragedy and a calling, a chance to protect his family and honor his heritage. As the night deepened, the villagers prayed for an end to the conflict, their voices carried by the wind across the barren landscape. In the distance, the faint hum of military vehicles hinted at the battles yet to come. In late 1987, the French radar station at Moussoro stood as a critical component of Operation EPERVIER, providing early warning of Libyan airstrikes. Guarded by 150 French troops, the base had become a symbol of resilience in the face of constant threat. One fateful afternoon, a massive sandstorm swept across the region, engulfing the base in a swirling wall of dust. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the eerie howling of the wind drowned out all other sounds. Soldiers hurried to secure equipment, their movements hindered by the stinging sand. For Captain Perrin, the storm was both a danger and an opportunity. "If we're blind, so are they," he told his men. With radar compromised, the base relied on old-fashioned vigilance. As the storm raged, sentries kept watch, their eyes scanning the shifting sands for any sign of movement. When the storm finally subsided, the horizon revealed a small convoy of Libyan vehicles advancing toward the base. The French forces swiftly mobilized, their preparations during the storm paying off. In a brief but decisive skirmish, the convoy was destroyed, further securing Moussoro's strategic importance. The road to Abesh was a lifeline for the Chadian military, connecting the Eastern Front to vital supply lines. In December 1987, this road became the focus of intense fighting as Libyan forces sought to cut off Chadian reinforcements. A convoy of Chadian trucks, carrying ammunition and food, set out under cover of night. Leading the convoy was Lieutenant Suleiman, who knew the terrain well. "The desert is our ally," he reminded his men. "It hides us and guides us." As dawn broke, the convoy came under heavy fire from Libyan ambushes. Tracer rounds lit up the sky as Suleiman's men returned fire, using the dunes as natural cover. The battle stretched for hours, each side refusing to yield. In the end, it was the Chadian soldiers' superior knowledge of the terrain and their indomitable spirit that turned the tide. The convoy reached Abesh with minimal losses, their arrival greeted with cheers from the garrison. For Suleiman, it was a moment of quiet pride, a testament to his leadership and the resilience of his troops. By early 1988, it was clear that Gaddafi's grand ambitions in Chad were faltering. Yet the Libyan leader refused to admit defeat. He ordered one final push to reclaim the Al-Yuzu Strip, pouring troops and resources into the effort. The Chadians, bolstered by French support, braced for the onslaught. At the forefront was President Habrek, whose confidence in his forces remained unshaken. "This is our land," he declared in a rousing speech. "And we will not surrender it." The battle for the Al-Yuzu Strip was fierce and relentless. Libyan tanks rumbled across the desert, their advance met by waves of Chadian fighters armed with anti-tank weapons. The skies above were filled with the roar of jet engines as French Mirages carried out precision strikes on Libyan supply depots. When the dust settled, the Libyans had suffered devastating losses. Their retreat marked the beginning of the end for Gaddafi's campaign in Chad. For the Chadians, it was a hard-fought victory, one that would resonate for years to come. Though the battles had subsided, the scars of war remained etched into the landscape and its people. In the village of Bardai, the return of peace brought mixed emotions. Families reunited, but the memory of lost loved ones lingered like a shadow. Idris, now a young man, took on the task of rebuilding his family's home. The once bustling village had been reduced to a quiet, solemn place. Yet even amidst the ruins, there was a sense of resilience. The villagers planted crops, repaired wells, and worked to restore a semblance of normalcy. For the soldiers who had fought and survived, the transition to peacetime was equally challenging. Many struggled with the weight of their experiences, haunted by the sights and sounds of battle. Sergeant Mahamat, who had lost several comrades, found solace in mentoring younger recruits, passing on the lessons he had learned. As the sun set over the desert, casting long shadows across the sands, the people of Chad reflected on their journey. They had endured years of hardship, but their spirit remained unbroken. Together, they faced the future, determined to build a brighter tomorrow. The desert was as much an enemy as the Libyan forces. By mid-1988, the Chadian soldiers learned to anticipate not only ambushes but also the perils of nature itself. One such trial came during a mission to survey the remote northern stretches near the Tibesti Mountains. A small patrol, led by Sergeant Mahamat, ventured into the unforgiving terrain. Their mission was to confirm reports of a hidden Libyan supply depot concealed within the rocky outcrops. Days into their journey, the unit faced a sudden sandstorm that disoriented their vehicles and drained their water supplies. Mahamat rallied his men, their survival hinging on his quick thinking. Using the stars as their guide, they navigated through the storm, eventually stumbling upon the suspected Libyan outpost. To their shock, it was heavily fortified with weapons and ammunition, proof of Gaddafi's relentless determination. The patrol radioed the coordinates back to Camp Mal. Hours later, French jets thundered overhead, destroying the depot in a fiery display. For Mahamat and his men, their survival and success cemented their reputation as masters of desert warfare. As Libya's influence waned, France extended its military presence to consolidate its gains and stabilize Chad. Operation EPERVIER, known in English as Operation Sparrowhawk, now encompassed a broader scope, with new bases established and additional troops deployed. In N'Djamena, French and Chadian officials worked tirelessly to coordinate logistics. Supplies flowed in from France, and the military camps became bustling centers of activity. Lieutenant Colonel Perrin, now overseeing multiple bases, implemented rigorous training programs to ensure his forces remained battle-ready. One such exercise involved joint drills with Chadian troops, simulating urban combat scenarios. For Chadian recruits like Idris, who had recently joined the army, it was an opportunity to learn from seasoned veterans. Under the guidance of Sergeant Mahamat, Idris honed his marksmanship and tactical skills, his determination earning him the respect of his peers. These preparations proved invaluable as Libyan forces launched sporadic raids to test the Allied defenses. Each skirmish strengthened the bond between the French and Chadian soldiers, their shared resolve driving them closer to a definitive victory. Zur, a small but strategically vital town near the Libyan border, became the next flashpoint in the conflict. In early 1989, Libyan forces sought to reclaim the area, launching a surprise attack at dawn. The town's defenders, a mix of Chadian regulars and local militia, fought desperately to hold their ground. The initial onslaught was devastating. Libyan tanks rolled through the narrow streets, their cannons reducing buildings to rubble. But the Chadians, undeterred, countered with a daring flanking maneuver. Under Lieutenant Suleiman's command, a small unit used the cover of night to infiltrate the enemy's rear, targeting their supply lines. As the battle raged, French air support arrived, bombing key Libyan positions. The tide turned, and by the following morning, the Libyan forces were in full retreat. Zur remained under Chadian control, its people celebrating the victory with cautious optimism. For Suleiman, the battle was a testament to the power of strategy and teamwork. "We fight not just for our land," he told his men, "but for the future of our people." By 1990, the war began to wane, though tensions remained high. The Al-Yuzu Strip, long contested between Chad and Libya, became the focal point of diplomatic negotiations. The international community, weary of the prolonged conflict, pressured both sides to seek a peaceful resolution. In Paris, high-level talks between French, Chadian, and Libyan officials laid the groundwork for a ceasefire. For President Habra, the challenge was balancing the demands of diplomacy with the sacrifices of war. "We fought for our sovereignty," he declared. "Now we must secure it through peace." On the ground, the soldiers remained vigilant, their weapons always within reach. Among them was Captain Dumont, who oversaw the withdrawal of French forces from certain forward positions. "The fighting may stop," he remarked, "but the scars of this war will linger for generations." As the first signs of peace emerged, the people of Chad cautiously returned to their homes. For Idris, now a seasoned soldier, the hope of rebuilding his country fueled his resolve. Together with his comrades, he prepared for a new chapter, one defined not by war but by the promise of a brighter future. The story of Operation Dragon Noir. In the early 1960s, the Democratic Republic of the Congo was a land simmering with tension. Recently liberated from Belgian colonial rule, its vast landscapes bore witness to the chaos of independence. Tribal factions, political ambitions, and Cold War ideologies clashed in a battle for control of the resource-rich nation. By 1963, the Simba Rebellion had emerged, a movement fueled by deep grievances, seeking to restore the spirit of Lumumba, the assassinated prime minister whose ideals of African unity still resonated with the people. As the rebellion grew, it garnered support from young men and women, many of whom believed in the mystical invincibility promised by their leaders. The name, Simba, meaning lion, captured their fierce resolve. But this rebellion was more than a local uprising, it became a stage where global powers wrestled for influence. With mercenaries, international interventions, and ideological fervor shaping its narrative, the Congo's struggle would escalate into a conflict that would forever alter its history. It began in the shadows of independence. In 1960, the Congo was freed from 75 years of Belgian rule, but the scars of colonization ran deep. The Belgians left behind a fragmented society, with little preparation for self-governance. Ethnic divisions, corrupt leadership, and the sudden vacuum of colonial power created fertile ground for unrest. While Patrice Lumumba sought to unite the country with his vision of Pan-Africanism, his ideals threatened foreign powers and local elites alike. By 1961, Lumumba was silenced, brutally executed, his body mutilated and dissolved in acid. His death sent shockwaves through the Congo and beyond. For his supporters, Lumumba became a martyr, and his dream of a united, independent Congo transformed into a rallying cry for rebellion. Among these were young leaders like Gaston Soumielat and Christophe Benaï, who began mobilizing forces in the eastern regions. The seeds of rebellion were sown, but the first sparks came in Kwilu, where Pierre Mulliel led an insurrection inspired by Lumumba's vision. Though quickly suppressed, the rebellion in Kwilu signaled the beginning of a wider, more ferocious struggle to reclaim the nation's soul. In late 1963, the Simba Rebellion erupted. What began as isolated uprisings in rural areas quickly gained momentum. The Simbas believed they were invincible, protected by traditional rituals and charms. Their leaders infused the movement with spiritual significance, claiming they could transform bullets into water. This mysticism inspired their followers and struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. The rebellion spread like wildfire, capturing entire provinces, including Stanleyville, now Kisangani. Government forces, unprepared and demoralized, abandoned their positions, leaving behind weapons and equipment that the Simbas eagerly seized. As the rebels advanced, they set their sights on establishing a government that echoed Lumumba's ideals, a socialist state free from neo-colonial influence. However, the rebellion's rapid expansion was not without brutality. Captured officials, perceived collaborators, and foreign nationals were taken hostage or executed. Villages sympathetic to the central government were razed. In their quest for liberation, the Simbas left a trail of blood and destruction. The Simba Rebellion soon attracted international attention. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, supported the beleaguered Congolese government. Belgium, haunted by its colonial legacy, sent military advisors and logistical aid. Meanwhile, Cuba, under Fidel Castro, supplied training and ideological support to the Simbas, seeing them as a crucial ally in the fight against imperialism. Mercenaries played a pivotal role in the conflict. Led by figures like Mike Hoare, known as Mad Mike, a multinational force of soldiers for hire was recruited to confront the Simbas. These mercenaries, equipped with modern weaponry and hardened by years of combat, became a formidable counterweight to the rebels. For the Congolese government, they were a necessary evil in their fight to reclaim territory. As the conflict escalated, the Congo became a microcosm of the Cold War. Ideologies clashed not only on the battlefield but also in the hearts of its people, torn between dreams of freedom and the grim realities of war. In August 1964, the Simba Rebellion reached its zenith. Stanleyville, the jewel of the eastern Congo, fell under their control. The rebels declared it the capital of their new regime, a symbol of their defiance against the central government and foreign interference. The capture of Stanleyville was a stunning achievement, but it came at a price. As their hold on the city strengthened, the Simbas methods grew increasingly harsh. Hostages, including foreign nationals, were paraded through the streets. For many, the atmosphere turned from jubilant to oppressive as fear took hold. The international community could not ignore the events in Stanleyville. Over 1,000 foreigners, including missionaries, diplomats, and aid workers, were trapped. The Simbas used them as bargaining chips, threatening execution if the government launched an attack. This tactic brought global scrutiny, with world leaders scrambling to find a way to rescue the hostages without igniting a larger crisis. Operation Dragon Rouge was conceived in secrecy. A joint Belgian and US effort, the plan involved elite paratroopers who would be dropped into Stanleyville to rescue the hostages. The mission required precise coordination and swift action. For the people of Stanleyville, the days dragged on, each moment brimming with tension. On November 24, 1964, the operation began. Belgian paratroopers descended upon the city, supported by airstrikes and local forces. The battle was fierce, with the Simbas fighting desperately to maintain control. Within hours, the hostages were freed, but the operation left a trail of destruction. For the Simbas, the loss of Stanleyville marked the beginning of their decline. Moise Tshombe, the controversial leader of Katanga, emerged as a key figure in the government's response to the rebellion. Once a separatist who led the breakaway Katanga state, Tshombe now found himself at the helm of the nation's efforts to quell the insurgency. His return to power in 1964 was met with mixed reactions. Some saw him as a pragmatic leader, while others viewed him as a traitor aligned with Western interests. Tshombe's strategy was ruthless but effective. He hired mercenaries to bolster the government's forces, including the infamous Mad Mike Hoare and his band of seasoned fighters. These soldiers were given free rein to confront the Simbas, using unconventional tactics that often blurred the lines of legality and morality. Tshombe also sought international backing, appealing to the United States and Belgium for financial and military aid. The Congolese army, previously demoralized and fractured, began to regroup under Tshombe's leadership. The mercenaries, armed with superior firepower and experience, turned the tide of the conflict. Village by village, province by province, the government forces reclaimed territory from the Simbas. But Tshombe's reliance on foreign powers and mercenaries alienated many Congolese. For those still loyal to the ideals of Lumumba, Tshombe represented everything they fought against: neocolonialism, exploitation, and betrayal. The rebellion might have been weakening militarily, but its ideological fervor remained unbroken. By 1965, the Simbas were on the defensive. Their once mighty rebellion, which had swept across the eastern Congo, was now confined to isolated pockets of resistance. Government forces, emboldened by their victories and bolstered by international support, launched a series of counteroffensives. Cities like Kindu and Bukavu fell, their recapture marked by brutal reprisals against suspected rebel sympathizers. The Simbas' morale crumbled as their leaders became fragmented. Internal divisions split the movement into factions, each vying for control but unable to mount a unified front. Supplies dwindled, and the promises of invincibility that once inspired the rank and file now seemed hollow. The mystical charms that had emboldened them in the early days of the rebellion offered no protection against modern weaponry. In the face of these losses, the Simbas turned to guerrilla tactics, retreating into the dense jungles of the Congo. Here, they waged a desperate insurgency, ambushing convoys and attacking isolated outposts. But even these efforts were unsustainable. Cut off from resources and allies, many rebels surrendered, while others melted into the countryside, blending back into civilian life. By November 1965, the rebellion was effectively over. The central government, under Tshombe's leadership, declared victory. But the scars of the conflict were everywhere: burned villages, shattered communities, and a nation left deeply divided. The Simbas may have been defeated, but the grievances that fueled their rebellion remained unresolved. The end of the Simba rebellion did not bring peace to the Congo. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter of instability. Tshombe's government, while victorious in battle, was unable to unify the country. His reliance on foreign powers and mercenaries left many Congolese disillusioned. In November 1965, General Mobutu Sese Seko seized power in a bloodless coup, promising to restore order and national pride. For the people of the Congo, the years that followed were marked by repression and corruption. Mobutu's regime, while bringing a semblance of stability, entrenched the very systems of exploitation that the Simbas had sought to overthrow. The legacy of the rebellion lived on in the memories of those who fought and suffered, a reminder of the Congo's turbulent path to independence. The international players who had intervened in the conflict moved on to other Cold War battlegrounds, leaving the Congo to grapple with its wounds. For the Congolese, the Simba Rebellion was not just a war, it was a symbol of their enduring struggle for self-determination, a dream that remained elusive in the shadow of history. Though the Simba Rebellion officially ended in late 1965, its remnants lingered in the vast, uncharted jungles of the Congo. Small bands of fighters continued to resist, driven by a mixture of desperation, loyalty to their fallen leaders, and a refusal to surrender to what they saw as an illegitimate government. These holdouts, often operating in remote and inaccessible regions, kept the dream of resistance alive, though their numbers and influence dwindled with each passing year. The jungles became their sanctuary, but also their prison. Supplies were scarce, and disease and hunger claimed more lives than combat. Yet, they remained a thorn in the side of the central government, staging sporadic ambushes and attacks on isolated military outposts. For many of these fighters, their rebellion was no longer about Lumumba or the ideals of socialism, it was about survival. In the government's view, these scattered resistance groups were a nuisance, but not a significant threat. The focus shifted to consolidating power in urban centers and rebuilding the nation's fractured economy. For the civilians caught in the crossfire, however, the presence of these rebels meant continued uncertainty and fear. Villages suspected of harboring Simba fighters faced brutal reprisals, perpetuating the cycle of violence and distrust. By the 1970s, most of the surviving Simbas had either surrendered or faded into obscurity. Yet, their struggle left an indelible mark on the Congo's history, a testament to the resilience of those who dared to dream of a better future, even in the face of insurmountable odds. Among the ranks of the Simba rebels were individuals whose lives intertwined in remarkable ways. One such figure was Pierre, a young schoolteacher who abandoned his classroom to join the rebellion. For Pierre, the rebellion was a deeply personal journey. He had witnessed the brutality of colonial rule and saw the rebellion as his chance to fight for dignity and justice. Pierre's story mirrored that of many young men and women who joined the Simbas. In the early days of the rebellion, he was swept up in the fervor of the movement, believing in the mystical powers promised by the leaders. But as the war dragged on, the harsh realities of conflict began to erode his idealism. He witnessed friends fall in battle, villages burned to the ground, and innocent lives lost in the chaos. Despite the hardships, Pierre remained committed to the cause. His loyalty was not to the leaders who had long since abandoned their fighters, but to the people he had sworn to protect. In the final days of the rebellion, Pierre led a small group of survivors deep into the jungle, vowing to continue the fight. Pierre's fate, like that of many Simbas, remains unknown. But his story lives on in the memories of those who knew him, a reminder of the sacrifices made by ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. The Simba Rebellion was not just a local conflict, it was a battleground for Cold War rivalries. The United States, driven by its policy of containing communism, provided logistical and financial support to the Congolese government. The CIA played a pivotal role, supplying intelligence and facilitating the recruitment of mercenaries. On the other side, Cuba saw the rebellion as a chance to expand its influence in Africa. Che Guevara himself traveled to the Congo in 1965, leading a group of Cuban fighters to support the Simbas. Che's mission was fraught with challenges, from logistical issues to cultural differences, and ultimately ended in failure. However, his presence underscored the global stakes of the conflict. For the Congo, this international involvement came at a cost. Foreign powers treated the country as a pawn in their geopolitical games, often ignoring the needs and aspirations of its people. The weapons, money, and mercenaries that poured into the region only deepened the violence and instability. Decades later, the legacy of the Cold War's intervention in the Congo remains a contentious topic. For some, it is a cautionary tale of the dangers of foreign interference. For others, it is a reminder of the Congo's resilience in the face of external and internal challenges. The Simba rebellion was largely driven by men, but women played a crucial and often overlooked role. From carrying supplies to tending the wounded, they were the backbone of the movement. Some, like Mama Kiala, took on leadership roles, rallying their communities to support the rebels. Mama Kiala's story is one of quiet strength. A widow with 3 children, she became a key organizer in her village, coordinating food and medical supplies for the Simbas. Her home became a refuge for fighters, a place where they could rest and regroup. But Mama Kiala's involvement came at great personal risk. When government forces raided her village, she was arrested and accused of aiding the rebels. Her imprisonment was brutal, yet she refused to betray her comrades. Her resilience inspired those who knew her, becoming a symbol of the silent sacrifices made by women during the rebellion. Today, the contributions of women like Mama Kiala remain largely unacknowledged. Yet their role in sustaining the rebellion, and their enduring spirit in its aftermath, is an integral part of the Congo's history. The use of mercenaries in the Simba rebellion remains one of its most controversial aspects. These soldiers for hire, drawn from Europe, South Africa, and Rhodesia, brought with them a brutal efficiency. Led by Mike Hoare, the mercenaries were not just combatants, they were a symbol of how foreign powers viewed the Congo as a theater for their ambitions. The mercenaries, often seen as saviors by the central government, had their own motivations. Many were veterans of colonial wars, seeking profit and adventure in the chaos of the Congo. Their tactics were ruthless, employing scorched earth strategies that terrorized not only the Simbas but also civilians caught in the crossfire. Entire villages were raised in operations designed to deny the rebels any safe haven. For the Congolese, the presence of mercenaries was a bitter pill. While their effectiveness helped turn the tide against the rebellion, their heavy-handed methods deepened resentment and distrust. To many, the mercenaries were a stark reminder of foreign exploitation, a modern iteration of the colonial forces that had dominated the Congo for decades. The mercenaries left the Congo after the rebellion was crushed, but their legacy endured. Their role in the conflict became a cautionary tale of how external interests could distort and exacerbate local struggles, leaving behind scars that would take generations to heal. As the Simbas faced mounting pressure, they resorted to desperate measures. By late 1964, they held over 1,000 hostages in Stanleyville, including Western diplomats, missionaries, and aid workers. The hostages were pawns in the rebels' final gambit, their lives a bargaining chip for political leverage. The hostage crisis gripped the world. Families in Europe and America watched in horror as reports of executions and abuse trickled out of Stanleyville. Diplomatic channels were flooded with pleas for action, but the central government hesitated, fearing the rebels would carry out their threats if military force was used. Operation Dragon Rouge was launched as a last-ditch effort to rescue the hostages. On November 24, Belgian paratroopers, supported by U.S. aircraft, descended on Stanleyville. The operation was a success, freeing most of the hostages, but it came at a cost. Dozens of hostages were killed in the chaos, and the city was left in ruins. The crisis marked a turning point in the rebellion. The Simbas' use of hostages alienated even their sympathizers, while the rescue operation demonstrated the central government's growing ability to assert control. But for the families of those lost, the scars of Stanleyville would never fade. In 1965, Che Guevara arrived in the Congo, bringing with him a contingent of Cuban fighters. Che saw the Simba Rebellion as part of a broader struggle against imperialism, a fight that aligned with his vision of global revolution. His mission was ambitious but fraught with challenges from the start. Che's group faced cultural and logistical barriers. The Congolese fighters were wary of their foreign allies, and communication was hindered by language and differing tactics. The Simbas' morale was already low by the time Che arrived, and their faith in the rebellion's mystical foundations clashed with Che's Marxist pragmatism. The mission faltered as the Cubans struggled to adapt to the terrain and the complexities of the conflict. After 7 months, Che withdrew, disillusioned but not defeated. His experiences in the Congo shaped his later writings and reinforced his belief in the need for better preparation in revolutionary struggles. Che's brief involvement in the Simba Rebellion became a footnote in his storied life, but it highlighted the global reach of the Cold War. The Congo was not just a battlefield for its people, it was a nexus where international ideologies collided, leaving a profound impact on its history. With the fall of Stanleyville, the government forces turned their attention to Kisangani, formerly Stanleyville. Once a major rebel stronghold, the city had become a symbol of resistance for the Simbas. Retaking it was both a strategic and symbolic priority for the central government. The battle for Kisangani was fierce. Government troops, supported by mercenaries and airstrikes, advanced methodically, cutting off supply lines and isolating the city. The Simbas, though weakened, fought with desperation, knowing that the loss of Kisangani would spell the end of their rebellion. Civilians bore the brunt of the fighting. Thousands fled the city, seeking refuge in the surrounding jungles. Those who remained endured days of relentless bombardment and street-to-street combat. By the time the government forces declared victory, Kisangani was a shadow of its former self, its streets littered with the debris of war. The fall of Kisangani marked the beginning of the end for the Simba Rebellion. Without their urban base, the rebels were forced to retreat into the countryside, where their fragmented forces struggled to maintain cohesion. The city's liberation was a grim victory, its devastation a stark reminder of the cost of war. By early 1965, the once dominant Simba Rebellion was in retreat. The government forces, bolstered by mercenaries and international aid, pressed their advantage, reclaiming territory that had been under rebel control for over a year. As the Simbas fled into the jungles, their unity fractured, and internal tensions rose. The leadership of the rebellion, once a coalition of determined visionaries, had splintered into rival factions. Christophe Benai, one of the key leaders, sought refuge in neighboring Uganda, while Gaston Sumialat attempted to rally the remaining fighters. The movement, which had promised liberation and justice, was now consumed by survival and infighting. For the ordinary fighters, the retreat was a harrowing journey. Food was scarce, disease spread rapidly, and the mystical beliefs that had once inspired them now felt hollow. Many began to question their cause, while others deserted, blending into the villages they passed. Despite their dire circumstances, the rebels maintained sporadic attacks on government outposts, hoping to delay their inevitable defeat. These ambushes, often carried out under the cover of darkness, served as a grim reminder that the rebellion, though weakened, was not entirely extinguished. The Congo of the mid-1960s was a nation divided not only by war but by ideology. The Simba Rebellion had drawn its strength from Lumumba's legacy, appealing to those who believed in African socialism and anti-imperialism. Yet, Many Congolese had grown weary of the constant upheaval and saw the central government as the only hope for stability. In rural areas, the rebellion's rhetoric resonated deeply. Traditional communities, marginalized by the government, saw the Simbas as champions of their struggles. However, in urban centers, where the scars of war were most visible, support for the rebellion waned. People who once sympathized with the Simbas began to turn against them, blaming them for the destruction and chaos. This division extended to the international stage. The United States and Belgium doubled down on their support for the central government, while nations like Cuba and China continued to back the Simbas, albeit with dwindling resources. The Congo became a symbol of the Cold War's broader struggle, a nation torn between competing visions of its future. As the rebellion faltered, the central government sought to capitalize on these divisions, portraying itself as the only force capable of uniting the Congo. Yet, the reality was far more complex. Even as the government regained control, the deep-seated grievances that fueled the rebellion remained unaddressed, sowing the seeds for future unrest. The mercenaries who fought alongside the central government became infamous for their brutal tactics. These soldiers, many of whom had fought in colonial conflicts across Africa, brought with them a ruthless efficiency that struck fear into the hearts of the Simbas and civilians alike. One such tactic was the use of psychological warfare. Mercenaries would spread rumors of their invincibility, often exaggerating their numbers and capabilities. This strategy demoralized the Simbas, who had relied heavily on their own mysticism to maintain morale. The rebels, once convinced of their bulletproof charms, began to fear the seemingly unstoppable mercenaries. Another controversial practice was the targeting of villages suspected of harboring rebels. Entire communities were razed, their residents forcibly relocated or executed. While these actions weakened the Simba support network, they also fueled resentment among the Congolese population, many of whom viewed the mercenaries as a return to colonial oppression. Despite their effectiveness, the mercenaries were a double-edged sword. Their actions undermined the legitimacy of the central government, which was increasingly seen as a puppet of foreign interests. For many Congolese, the presence of these foreign fighters was a stark reminder that true independence remained elusive. By mid-1965, the Simbas were cornered. Their numbers had dwindled, and their leaders were scattered. Yet, in the remote eastern provinces, a core group of rebels made a final stand. They established a base in the rugged highlands, using the terrain to their advantage in a desperate bid to hold off government forces. The government launched a series of offensives to dislodge the rebels, each one more brutal than the last. The Simbas fought with a ferocity born of desperation, ambushing convoys and launching surprise attacks on encampments. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the rebellion might regain its footing. But the government's overwhelming firepower, combined with the relentless pursuit of the mercenaries, proved too much. One by one, the rebel strongholds fell, leaving the Simbas with nowhere to run. In the final battle, deep in the heart of the jungle, the last remnants of the rebellion were crushed. For the Simbas, their defeat marked the end of a dream. For the central government, it was a victory, but one that came at a staggering cost. The nation was left scarred, its people divided, and its future uncertain.